All right, excellent. Greetings, everyone. My name is Curtis Page, aka the Nomad. We have a very special guest with us today, Bernardo Kastrup. And Bernardo has a background in both science and philosophy, both writing in technical journals in scientific topics related to things like AI, as well as philosophical topics in more recent publications in his personal work, such as books like, I think your recent one is Brief Peeks Beyond.
That's the latest that has been published, yes.
And prior to that, you had Why Materialism is Baloney.
That's right.
Meaning and Absurdity, Dreamed Up Reality, and I believe it's Rationalist Spirituality. I think those were your 5 publications. For some reason, I thought you had 6, but
there's one coming out now in April. Within the month, there will be another one, More Than Allegory.
Oh, okay.
And people can already pre-order it. Yeah, that's why you heard of it. Yeah.
Awesome. So what I want to do is I kind of want to start, with an introduction. So if you don't mind, could you give us a brief background of yourself, your credentials, your experience in both the scientific and sort of philosophical realm, and give us an outline, a basic introduction about who you are personally.
Yeah, so it all started for me with science and technology, which is my formal background. I have a master's in electronics engineering with a specialization in artificial intelligence, expert systems, and a PhD in computer engineering with specialization in reconfigurable computing. I worked a lot in AI. I worked at CERN as an engineer, working on the data acquisition system of the Atlas detector of the Large Hadron Collider. I've started a company in the field of microprocessor architecture, a reconfigurable computing company that today is part of Intel, was acquired by Intel in 2011. I still am in the corporate world, working in semiconductors technology, Moore's Law, corporate strategy, and all that good stuff. And then in parallel to all this, for many years, I have had an interest in philosophy, both continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. And I've written now 6 books. I'm busy with book number 7, with a focus on ontology, the nature of reality. What is this? What is this game that we are all playing here? What is the nature of our condition in the world? And what is the world? What do we call life? These are the questions that really appeal to my heart and which I try to address in my work.
Yeah, excellent. And just for the viewers, like some of your background you've talked to a lot of people with opposing positions. I know that you've been on a panel discussion with some other thinkers such as yourself, but you've debated the likes of Michael Shermer. I know that you've had a couple back and forths with Novella on your blog. Tell us a little bit about that and how you've sort of refined your position in light of.
Well, Michael was on stage with me, but he didn't really engage. I mean, I challenged him a couple of times and I put straightforward questions to him, but he didn't engage. Who did engage me on that very same occasion was Leonard Mlodinow, who wrote a book with Stephen Hawking. And it was a nice exchange. It's available online on video, so people can judge for themselves who got on top of that one. I'm not going to pass any judgment. People can see it for themselves. With Novella, it was basically a written exchange. He challenged me on his blog, I answered, and back and forth went on for like 5 or 6 iterations. It was fun also. It is fun to engage militant physicalists or materialists because they are very, very self-assured of their position. They think they really hold the logical, rational, and empirical high ground. And they are used to debating people who come from a totally different angle in terms of values. People who say, well, it's not only about logic, it's not only about empiricism, it's about intuition, it's about the heart. And then they just wash the floor with these people because they take this rational high ground. And my style is completely different. I basically share the same values as they claim to have, rationality, logical consistency, empirical honesty, parsimony, and I argue on the basis of those values. And that tends to get them very confused because they are not used to this. They're not used to somebody arguing against physicalism on grounds of internal consistency, parsimony, the simplest explanation, Occam's razor, explanatory power, and so on. And that confusion sometimes translates into what I could only interpret as a little bit of anger and excitement in the way they debate, which only makes it more interesting to me, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've definitely found that to be true. Also, there is a sense of being self-assured when it comes to many, not all, that hold sort of the physicalist and the materialist position. But I have found that there are some really, really brilliant and developing thinkers that are coming out of Blab. And I've had some really good, honest engagements. And I actually really respect that, especially even if they don't hold the same position that I hold. I have found that in many ways, they have been very receptive and welcoming. And I think for the most part, charitable. So how do we frame this discussion? How do we get at the nature of reality, and how do you approach worldview discussions in principle? How do you enter that?
Well, I think we have to agree on some basic values. What are the criteria for deciding which alternative is closest to truth insofar as we can know? And I think it is valid to choose values such as ontological parsimony. We don't want to postulate more entities than are needed in order to explain our shared experiences. Internal consistency. We cannot have an ontology that contradicts itself. And empirical honesty. Whatever ontology one proposes has to explain, or at least be consistent with, everything that we can observe in the world beyond any reasonable doubt, to use a legal term. And on the basis of these three values, I think there are some clear choices that we can make about which ontology is closest to truth. And it isn't physicalism. And the body of my work is an argument for what I just said.
Sure, excellent. Yeah, I've definitely found the same principles to sort of apply to my experience in developing my worldview. I've been in the physicalist realm, and I've kind of been both, in the hard idealist solipsist camp, and really tried to evaluate it. And I found that as I bounce back and forth between some of the ideas, I've been shaving off different ends, and I've kind of come to a little bit more of a central, more clear picture of what I think is most parsimonious. But absolutely, I think the discussion does need to be framed, and we do need to have at least an underlying substructure to agree upon, at least if we are going to say that we do share the same reality, that there is some type of consensus. So I think it's very important. So what are some of the things, or how would you explain the importance of even engaging with these ideas? How would you encourage, or what would be some lines of thought that you would give to someone to encourage them to take these thoughts seriously in philosophy?
Yeah, what we technically call ontology, or a narrative for the nature of being, of ourselves and the world, it sounds very technical and very specific. Everybody is, whether they are aware of it or not, living according to a certain ontology. We all either make or import from the cultural narrative certain assumptions, postulates, and hypotheses about the nature of the world, the nature of life, and the purpose, if any, and meaning, if any, of our participation in it. And even if you're not aware of it, at a subliminal level, you make those assumptions, you import those assumptions from the cultural narrative, that they change how you feel about your life, how you feel about yourself, how you feel about others and the world. It influences every aspect of your life. What you choose to do as a profession, whether you see any meaning, how you relate to the prospect of death, your own and those of your loved ones. So it is very pervasive. It may be subliminal, but it's very pervasive. So I think it is extraordinarily important for us to to keep on improving our mainstream cultural narrative as far as our view of the nature of reality is concerned, because this is impacting everything, not only how subjective feel, but how we drive our economy, what calibrates our behavior, how we treat the environment, political systems, social systems, how we treat the mentally challenged, or I don't like this expression either, but mentally ill is worse, or people who don't conform to the average. I think that is the best descriptive way to put it. It influences everything. It may be even the most important question of life, because it colors all other questions. It establishes a sort of an underlying background for everything you do, everything you think, and everything you feel. And it's highly underestimated. So underestimated that we took as default a certain ontology, the physicalist ontology, and we don't even question it anymore. We think that it's a matter of refining. I think it's not a matter of refining at all. I think physicalism is extraordinarily wrong at a very fundamental, basic level. I think it's ridiculously wrong, and I think it can be argued that it is ridiculously wrong, and it is influencing our lives, our political systems, our economy, our behavior on this planet in ways that are not as close to truth as they should be. In fact, in ways that are very far away from truth.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. And it does seem like, the current paradigm is to sort of presuppose, what, establish my axioms and presuppose them throughout how I interpret the world before me. I think that's what many of us do anyway. But I have found that many, at least on the physicalist and the materialist side, tend to not view those positions as sort of presuppositions. They think that anything beyond what I can experience as natural is an actual presupposition. But when it comes to the external empirical world, those things are not presuppositions. Those things are almost self-evident. You know what I mean? A few words about that. How would you approach someone with a mentality that, in many ways, rejects the basis of things like philosophy, would reject the significance of even having to question whether there's an empirical world or what it would mean for an empirical world to be? How do you approach that?
It's an extraordinary lack of introspection and critical ability, and it happens at the highest levels in our culture today. Famous scientists take this attitude that you're describing. The only thing we can have empirical access to is our own stream of perceptions. Perceptions are subjective experiences. They have the qualities of experience. They consist of the qualities of experience and nothing else. Anything else is abstraction of thought. And we can also observe that our stream of subjective perceptions tend to be consistent with what other people report about their streams of subjective perceptions. So we seem to share the same world. The laws that govern this world seem to be very independent from our volition. We can't change the laws of physics by wishing them to be different. We have some other canonical observations, like brain activity correlates very well with what subjects report from their inner lives. So these are all facts, but none of this embodies, entails, or implies that there is a world outside subjectivity, because all we have access to are these streams of subjective experiences. So to take physicalism, the existence of a world fundamentally independent and outside consciousness, as an empirical datum is simply wrong. It is simply false. That is, people who believe in the idea that there is a world outside subjective experience and which then generates and modulates subjective experience, they are arriving at a philosophical inference, a postulate or an inference, one of the two. I have doubts about which one would apply better. I tend towards a postulate, but I accept people who say it's an inference. But it isn't an empirical fact in its own merit. We have no access to anything beyond subjective experience. So the question that poses itself to us is, do we need to make that inference in order to explain these three canonical facts I just mentioned, the correlations between brain activity and subjective experience, the fact that we all seem to share the same world, and the fact that the laws of physics don't give a damn about what we want or don't want. Do we need to postulate physicalism, to infer physicalism, to explain these three facts? Or can these three facts be explained without postulating a whole universe beyond knowledge, a whole universe outside subjective experience? The body of my work is to a large extent to explain these three facts without postulating a world outside consciousness, but simply inferring that consciousness itself extends beyond the face value boundaries of a personal self. In other words, I'm basically inferring that the Earth goes beyond the horizon instead of inferring that the flying spaghetti monster creates our perception from outside subjective experience. A dramatic metaphor, but I think it drives the point.
Yeah, right, sure. No, so let's define some terms a little bit. Let's sort of isolate, perhaps for the sake of the viewers and those that are not as familiar with some of the philosophical terms, what we're dealing with. You know, there's a couple different positions when it comes to metaphysical assumptions or the basis of where you start. One of them, of course, is idealism. You do have dualism, which would say, so even if we start with idealism, I'll jump back quickly. That's essentially saying that mind is the fundamental state of reality and all things proceed from that, give or take. Dualism would say that there are two categories of ontology as a fundamental state of reality, and there is some level of participation between both that gives rise to our experience universally. Both idealism and materialism are monistic pictures of reality, so they would be single substance-based accounts for the world at large. And then we have things like neutral monism, where there's some other third substance that sort of gives rise to these two distinct categories of reality, and then you have interaction from there. So give us an idea of your position in light of those, and break that down a little bit more for us.
Yeah, I don't like the isms, but I accept that I live in a world where the isms exist, so I have to put up with them. So let's go for the isms. The most skeptical position anyone can take is solipsism, which is the idea that all that exists is your personal mind, that all reality is your personal dream, and that all other living creatures, including other people, are just images in your mind. So if I were a solipsist, I would believe that Curtis does not exist, that Curtis is just a figment of my own imagination, that there is nothing it is like to be Curtis. There is only something it is like to be Bernardo. Now, there's a number of reasons why this is not even the simplest explanation. It's the most skeptical in a way, but not the simplest. Because other people are analogous to us, they manifest behaviors that are analogous to our own behaviors that we know we manifest because we are conscious. So you would have to explain other people's behavior in a different way, which is at least inelegant. The next one is idealism, or non-dual conscious realism. There are many names for it. In the West, it has been traditionally called idealism. In the East, it has traditionally been called non-dualism. And that's the idea that, yes, everything is in mind, everything exists only insofar as it is in consciousness, but not in your personal consciousness alone. Mind is not restricted to my own personal mind or to your own personal mind. What we experience as personal minds are dissociated complexes, dissociated alters of a transpersonal, universal form of consciousness, a universal form of mind. And that there is an external world indeed, external to your personal dissociated alter, but not external to consciousness itself. So there is no appeal to a different ontological category, such as matter outside mind. The next one would be physicalism, which is also monist. But if a coherent account of physicalism / materialism is to be made, it needs to deny consciousness, which is precisely what some physicalists do, like Daniel Dennett, like Michael Graziano, Patricia and Paul Churchland, not in as extreme a way as the first two, but they do deny certain aspects of experience, which I think is it's just silly. Whatever consciousness is, here we have consciousness denying that consciousness exists. It's ridiculous in my mind. These people have written books with hundreds of pages articulating this position, but the core of their argument is basically under the carpet definition of consciousness. You cannot deny that which generates the idea that consciousness does not exist. What generates that idea? Consciousness, whatever it is. Whatever it is, it's consciousness that creates that idea. You cannot deny that. So they end up in a linguistic game that people like materialist philosopher Strawson has called looking glassing, which is a game of implicit redefinition of terms that, anyway. The other one would be dualism, which is favored by some serious neuroscientists today, the idea that there is mind and there is matter, and that matter modulates but does not constitute mind. This is an important distinction. Many dualists will say matter modulates mind, like the finger of a guitar player modulates the vibrations of the guitar string, but matter doesn't constitute mind for the same reason that the guitar player's finger doesn't constitute the string. And then there would be neutral monism, dual aspect monism. There is a whole zoo of things. But we can leave it at that.
No, absolutely. So it's interesting that you would mention those with opposing views. What has been like the general counter to your position in particular? How have people tried to address that or even wrestle with it? Or do they even, is it a hostile engagement oftentimes? Have you found that people have been very receptive to it?
No, there is every kind. There's every kind out there. I have had some interesting interactions with Jerry Coyne, for instance, who is very hostile, very verbose, and a bit crass in a certain way. And he uses silly arguments. One argument I hear, most people who go against idealism don't understand what idealism is saying. They basically misinterpret, misunderstand it, create a straw man, and then proceed to destroy the straw man and sing victory, all the while making a fool of themselves. For instance, Jerry Coyne said, of course idealism cannot be right, because we have plenty of evidence for the existence of the universe before consciousness arose. This is as circular as it gets. It begs the question of materialism in an argument for materialism. It assumes materialism in order to argue for materialism. You see, it is materialism that says that certain physical arrangements in the form of biological organisms generate consciousness. What idealism is saying is that matter arises in consciousness, that consciousness isn't generated by matter. So of course there was a universe before there was life. Life is the image of a dissociative process in consciousness. But there was consciousness before there were dissociative processes. There were other kinds of processes that corresponded to the physical universe before the birth of life. So his very criticism begs the question. And most criticism in my book, Brief Peeks Beyond, I list 16 very frequent criticisms of idealism. Most of them embody some form of circularity. They beg the question at one level or another. Like there's another one, people like to say, well, if the whole universe were in a form of consciousness, that would require an incredibly complex being to explain the universe, and that's not parsimonious. Well, that begs the question that consciousness is generated by something else that is very complex. The point here is that consciousness is the ontological primitive, like in an analogous way that under certain variations of materialism, the quantum vacuum would be the ontological primitive, that everything would arise as excitations of the quantum vacuum. And the complexity of nature doesn't require the quantum vacuum itself to be even more complex. Now, idealism basically says that the whole universe arises as excitations of a transpersonal form of consciousness. The complexity of the universe doesn't require that consciousness itself be even more complex than the phenomena it generates. This is complexity theory one-on-one. In a very simple rules, very simple constraints, can lead to very complex behavior. Just look at cellular automata. So basically what idealism is saying is analogous to quantum field theory in a way, is that transpersonal consciousness with very simple rules of behavior or archetypes, if we want to use psychological language, transpersonal archetypes can generate incredible complexity, just like the quantum field can generate incredible complexity based on very simple rules. I could go on, but you get a taste of it.
And even in contemporary science, there's a lot of things, or physics, sorry. There are many things that are actually calling into question the fundamental state of classical Newtonian physics. You know what I mean? We even have things like consciousness causing collapse of the wave particle duality. So in many senses, there's this sort of retreat back to trying to explain it, and we've sort of drilled down so far that we've realized that we can't get behind ourselves and we in many senses need ourselves to unify almost two categories that are
it will never work.
Yeah.
It's a reflection of tremendous confusion. You see, the very moment that we postulate or infer a whole world outside subjectivity, outside consciousness itself, the very moment we do that, and we infer that our subjectivity, our world, is created by this inferred, postulated world outside, we start chasing our own tails. Let me give you an example. We talk a lot about the hard problem of consciousness, the impossibility to deduce the qualities of experience from the parameters of physical arrangements. The hard problem, although valid from a physicalist framework, it's an invention of confused thinking. Even in a physicalist perspective, you still need to postulate or infer an ontological primitive, that whose behavior explains everything else. So you can reduce everything to the ontological primitive. An idealist would take consciousness itself as the ontological primitive. So consciousness doesn't need to be explained, in the same way that the quantum vacuum doesn't need to be explained, or that the brains of M theory don't need to be explained. They are primitives. They are what there is, and you explain everything else in terms of the primitive. But once you postulate another primitive than consciousness, then not only you have to explain everything else in terms of that primitive, you have to explain consciousness in terms of that primitive as well. And then the hard problem comes into play. We will never solve that. We are chasing our own tails. Here's this consciousness abstracting something outside itself and then saying, somehow I am that, and I don't know how I can explain it. We will never be able to explain that.
Right. Two of the biggest things, let me introduce Chris here also. Chris often co-hosts
hey, Chris.
These Blab sessions that I hold, and obviously, Chris, you're familiar with Bernardo. We've discussed him in the past, and we do a lot of discussions on worldview, positions, and idealism, as well as just various philosophical topics. But let's quickly outline what the hard problem of consciousness is in general, because some people I don't think may be familiar with that. And I think you gave a very good, concise sort of description of that. But let's break it down a little bit more. And then Chris, feel free to make any additions to that also.
Do you want me to
give it a
please. Go? Okay. The core of the problem is that even, can I speak technical terms? Is the audience willing to take it, or should I try to?
I would break it down a little bit more.
Okay.
And then perhaps even if you want to use some technical terms, and then I might jump in and I'll just ask you to translate, or yeah.
Okay. We may be able to go as far, and I'm going to translate this technical term. I will use it first and then I'll translate it. We may be able to go as far as finding a complete bijective function between physical arrangements and the qualities of experience. In other words, find a complete one-to-one mapping between particular physical parameters and particular qualities of experience, and the other way around. So there is a precise mapping between the two. Even if we could get to that stage, which we may, I'm a bit skeptic, but I'm open to that possibility. We may. But finding a mapping does not allow us to deduce one from the other in terms of how the qualities are experienced by ourselves. For instance, how do you deduce the redness of red, the warmth of love, the bitterness of disappointment from particular arrangements of mass, charge, momentum, geometry, parameters of physical arrangements? You can't. Even if you find a mapping, there is still what is called an explanatory gap between the two. That mapping would be just as good, for instance, for dualism, in which matter modulates consciousness without constituting it. It would be good for idealism, in which what we call matter are the images of certain processes in consciousness. It's also amenable to that mapping. It would also require and entail that mapping. What the hard problem of consciousness basically says is that, unlike what physicalism requires, physical arrangements cannot constitute consciousness. They may be able to explain consciousness from a dualist perspective, even from an idealist perspective, in which you reinterpret what we call the physical, but they can't constitute consciousness as things that are fundamentally outside and independent of consciousness, because you can't deduce the qualities of experience from the parameters of physical arrangements. Even in principle, you can't do that even in principle. So it's not a matter of one day we will get there.
We're getting a little bit of feedback. Is that on your end, Chris?
I don't think so. I'm not getting any feedback.
Oh, I'm getting it.
Let me see here. Go ahead and.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead and continue. If Chris, if you're not talking at the moment, do you mind putting your yourself on mute?
Yeah, where's that mute button again on here?
It's right on the on your window. Yeah, just the bottom left corner there. So.
Yeah, I don't see one here.
It's a little audio icon just on your video.
Yeah, hold on. I think I need to expand my browser 1 second.
But yeah, please continue.
I think I made the point. I'll proceed and give my view of why.
Okay,
why
yeah,
this
perfect.
is hopeless. I think the hard problem of consciousness is only applicable under the physicalist inference of a world outside consciousness that in turn generates consciousness. But who makes that inference? It is mind, it is consciousness that makes that inference. So here we have consciousness trying to project its own nature onto one of its own abstractions. Basically, we are chasing our own tails, and that's why the problem is fundamentally insoluble, even in principle, because it's a basic error in thinking. We just tied a knot in our own intellect, and we placed ourselves into a situation that is impossible to solve. We are basically inventing the problem through thought abstraction that is unjustified.
Yeah, one of the ways that that I've sort of a more formal philosophical approach to it. So, again, two of the biggest problems that I've sort of approached with regards to the nature of reality, at least in explaining consciousness, have been one, intentionality. I think that's the root of consciousness in itself, which is sort of the mind's ability to be about something, being directed towards a particular set of content, and the subjective experience, the subjective look and feel of things. I think some philosophers would call it qualia. I do think that there's a little bit of a subtle confusion with the term qualia, because I oftentimes don't know whether they're talking about the object, or they're talking about the subject, or they're just talking about the relationship between the object and the subject as referring to qualia. But I think fundamentally it does come down to experience. And we have an experience of both things abstract, as in relationships between things, and that come in the form of numerical values and concepts. And then we have the things in themselves, that qualitative look and feel of a particular thing,
Yeah,
like the color.
Yeah.
Right.
Very Kantian, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So it seems very, and in many ways, my approach has been quite simple. And when I talk about it, I'll usually say something like, if we're going to say consciousness is what it's abstracting out, beyond itself, like matter or any abstract object. Whatever is true of consciousness must be true of that object if they are indeed identical. You know what I mean? Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I follow you. I think we do tend to make, in philosophy in general, and I'm making myself as guilty as anybody else. Clearly, you have a philosophy background. We tend to make things more complicated than they need to be. For instance, the whole discussion about qualia. I use the term qualities of experience because that's what it is. And there is nothing but qualia. Your entire life has never had anything but qualia. You've never had access to anything but the qualities of experience. And if you did, you don't know it. By definition, you cannot know it because knowledge is unconscious experience. And then we start abstracting. We start saying, well, but there is something outside experience, and there is an object and a subject, and how do these things relate to one another? And layers of abstraction start being built, and we get lost in this forest of abstractions that we create. I think abstractions are very useful for predictive purposes. And I'm taking an anti-realist position here, modeling the world. Yeah, things behave as if, and then there comes your list of abstractions. That's useful. It's very useful for engineering purposes. It's very useful for modeling and predicting the behavior of things. It has a practical, very pragmatic application. And I think there is where abstract reigns supreme. It has extreme uses, very useful. The error comes when we translate a as though model full of abstractions. The world behaves as though it were like this and that existed and so on. This is useful, but the moment you take this as those and say this is, now you cornered yourself. Now you got lost in a forest of abstractions. And all these problems of philosophy, including the hard problem of consciousness, arise from that. If you take a step back, if you're looking at ontology and not engineering, if you're not trying to predict the world, if you're not trying to improve the game, but to see through the game, to understand the nature of life and reality, you have to step out of this forest of abstractions and come back to your primary experience, the basic datum of experience. What is there? What is there are qualia. There is nothing else. Everything else is a construct of thought. It's an abstract in thought, which are themselves qualia, because thoughts are experiences and have the qualities of experience. So I think the greatest problem we have today is this conflation between science and philosophy. In which we take the useful as though models and abstractions of engineering informed by science, and we turn those into a philosophical, an ontology, a philosophical worldview. There we get completely lost.
You have an illustration that you use often, where you sort of describe things in consciousness as an image of a process of consciousness. Do you make an ontological distinction between consciousness and the image? Or are you saying that there's an identity equivalence between the image and consciousness itself? How do you tackle that? And then if you, go ahead with that first and then.
So suppose you have a guitar string at rest. There's only the guitar string, right? Now the guitar string vibrates and it displays a certain vibratory pattern that you can draw, you can hear. It has characteristics. It has properties. Is a vibrating guitar string different from a guitar string at rest? Is there anything more to a vibrating guitar string other than the guitar string?
So I think some might say, for example, that if we adhere to one ontological category, we've accounted for similarity in that category. But we can't necessarily appeal again to that same category to account for dissimilarity within that category.
But that's exactly what I'm trying to do right now.
So
let's go back to the question.
Yeah.
Is there anything more to a vibrating guitar string other than the string itself?
Perhaps not. I think I can grant that tentatively, so that you can kind of go. Okay. But I don't know if Chris wanted to jump in really quickly.
Yeah. I think yes, there is actually to that. Well, because I think, I mean, unless I'm misunderstanding you, Bernardo, it sounds like what you're saying is in line with Aristotle's way of thinking, which is substantism. So, Aristotle's solution to the problems that Plato was tackling, like Parmenides and Heraclitus, these problems of change and permanence, was to say that, you have substance, which has an essence, and then you have accidents, right? So in saying that the vibrating, the string itself would be the substance, perhaps the essence, right? And the accidental features would be perhaps the vibrations. But I'm not really so convinced that Aristotle's solution works. I mean, I would say that I would side more with Plato insofar as we still have to account for the predicates. And the predicates in this case would be the vibrations and what other things we can attribute to the change. In other words, like Curtis said, the differences. So we have similarities, we have differences. But how can we account for that on essence?
The predicates already exist in potentiality in the guitar string at rest. I'm resisting getting down into the technicalities because I'm trying to make an argument that's very intuitive first. Maybe later on we can jump in. But let me ask the question in a different way. If I handed you a guitar string at rest, and then I handed you later a vibrating guitar string, in the latter case, would I have handed you anything different or extra or more than I handed you in the first case? Is there anything to that vibrating guitar string that wasn't there, at least in potential, in the guitar string at rest that I gave you first?
I would say, I mean, if we were to reduce...
If you say yes, I'll ask you what? Huh? If you say yes, there is something to the vibrating guitar string that wasn't there in the guitar string at rest, I'll ask you, what is it?
I would say that it would be something along the lines of form. So there's the object itself that accounts for the substantive, nature of this guitar string. And then there would be form, or you can, some would call it information, but you can call it information in motion. Some would relate it to energy of some kind.
Ontologically,
I mean, if we're going to talk about one, I mean, I can grant that tentatively. I can say no to kind of go along with that thought.
No, but I don't want you to just surrender to me.
No.
I'll give you another example.
I think I can revisit that, but I want to kind of see where you're going first, and then perhaps we go back.
Another example. There is a dancer on stage. He knows his choreography through and through, but he's not moving. He's there on stage. 10 minutes later, that same dancer is dancing. Now there is a dance on stage. Is there anything to the dance that wasn't there in the dancer? Is there any ontological distinction between the dance and that which dances? Or is the dance just the dancer in movement, the dancer manifesting its intrinsic potentiality?
Right. I would agree that it is the dancer manifesting externally its intrinsic potentiality. But I would still say that there's a distinction between, let's just say, the dancer and the knowledge the dancer has, in a sense that it's possible that the dancer can lack this knowledge in a particular way. Let's say, for example.
Now you're taking the metaphor beyond what I
hope I
intended it.
Sure.
I understand what you're saying. The point I want to make is that in my view, the diversity of nature is the dance of consciousness, the vibration of the guitar string of consciousness. So to go back to your original question, there is nothing to the images, but consciousness itself, because the images are excitations, modulations, movements, vibrations, behaviors, dances of consciousness, whatever metaphor you find more appropriate. So I think there is nothing to the images but consciousness, for the same reason that there is nothing to the dance but the dancer. Yet the images manifest the intrinsic potentialities of consciousness. And because there is diversity in that manifestation, there are many modes of vibration of a guitar string. There are many possible choreographies that a dancer can dance. There are many different ways in which water can ripple. The diversity comes from the behavior of the ontological entity, from the the manifestation in space-time of the different potentialities already intrinsic to that one ontological entity. But for the same reason that there is nothing to a ripple but water, that diversity is nothing but that one ontological entity. So the image is consciousness, although there is variety in the images and consciousness is only one.
So let's take that analogy now and then sort of try to apply it in a little bit more of a one, just overlay it onto the properties of consciousness in itself per se, So we have the dancer would be consciousness, let's just say, and first I guess I would ask you to define what you mean by consciousness, probably in a general sense. Yeah.
Consciousness is that which experiences. Or if I could do it in a more operational way, but it already embodies some philosophy in it, a position in it, consciousness is that whose excitations are experiences.
Okay. So yeah, I have pretty much the same view. Consciousness is that which knows, understands, and experiences. So I just identified like different categories of experiences. So go ahead, Chris. I kind of want to hear. Yeah,
I just wanted to point out, I mean, I think part of the problem with consciousness, well, defining it, I mean, especially if in a anti-realist way, is that it becomes purely ostensive, right? I mean, even to say, consciousness is that which experiences in similar such definitions, there's a circularity there, because we would ultimately say, well, you just have to kind of like see it, you just have to experience it. And it's kind of the point, but at the same time, analytically, it puts us in a position where we have an axiom, but of course, like any axiom, it can't be defined. And, maybe that's. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll dispute that. Do you agree that at least linguistically, there cannot be experience without an experient? That's a point Frege made already in the 50s. Can there be experience without that which experiences? Does experience entail an experiencer, at least linguistically?
Yeah, well, I would agree with you there. I mean, as Curtis knows, like, I'm kind of a Husserlian, right? In terms of, my views on consciousness very parallel in a lot of ways. Views taken from Husserl's phenomenology, and I go beyond phenomenology and like to get into metaphysics. But I would agree with that in the sense that, yes, experience is necessarily subjective. Ultimately, it has to fall back on the subject, the experiencer. Self-referential consciousness is an inevitable conclusion here. So I totally agree. But however, though, that's kind of that's a double-edged sword, though, because when you say that, you're going to have to then, I would argue, differentiate between now the experiencer and what isn't the experiencer. Now this doesn't. Okay, hold on. And without giving the argument for supporting that position, I'm just saying that I would argue in that vein. But once you make that distinction, that doesn't necessarily mean that what is experienced, which isn't the experiencer, exists independent of the experiencer. There could still be an idealism of sorts even in just admitting that subject-object distinction at an ontological level.
Yeah,
right?
I kind of hold the position of a dual aspect idealist, where I do think mind is the ground of phenomenon, you know what I mean? Distinct phenomenon and event succession in space-time, because I think it's what localizes experience. It's what isolates things in this experience from even abstract objects. So it says, I'm instantiating this and not this. Whereas if you were to step back and not create a particular about anything, then you just have a fulfillment of all potentials there. But when something becomes actual is when something comes to the fore and everything else steps to the back. And you get a sort of a universe when you start enacting specific laws and sustaining them intentionally, whether in a qualitative sense or in an abstract sense. But yeah, I wanted you to kind of respond to that, Bernardo. And
comment. There's lots to comment on.
Yeah, no, sure.
Okay, I have a mental list. Let me try to cover my mental list from the beginning. Physicalism also requires that there be an experiencer for there to be experiences. So the point I made that experiences are the excitation of an experiencer is not conflicting with physicalism. Under physicalism, the experiencer are active neural networks in your brain. Their excitations or their activity, their electrochemical activity constitute experience. So the point I made is still valid. Physicalism has an indirection, though. It would say that there is a primitive called, in one articulation, it would be the quantum vacuum, or the basic menu of subatomic particles of the standard model, or superstrings, or the brains of M theory, whatever you want to take. I would take the quantum vacuum because it's easier for me to do the analogy. So physicalism would say there is a quantum vacuum. Its excitations create matter. Certain arrangements of matter constitute an experiencer, and experiences are excitations of the experiencer. So you have these several layers. My position is the experiencer is already consciousness itself. It is the primitive. The quantum vacuum is consciousness. It's a way of describing consciousness. And experiences are excitations of the subject. They are not distinct from the subject ontologically for the same reason that ripples are not distinct from water, that a dance is not distinct from the dancer. Ontologically, they are the same, but the variety and the relationships come in the form of the different patterns of excitation that you can have. So basically, I'm taking physicalism and eliminating one step of indirection. Instead of saying there is an abstract primitive called the quantum vacuum, which through a step of indirection creates the experiencer and then experiences, I'm saying the experience itself is the ontological primitive. It is that which you can't model, explain, or make sense of. It's nature's given. Now, a point that Chris made, you appealed for a moment there, Chris, to the need to have a co-definition between terms for a term to have any meaning. So you said, well, for there to be an experiencer, there has to be something that isn't the experiencer. If you take consciousness itself as the ontological primitive, you escape that. For the same reason that under quantum field theory, the quantum vacuum exists and there is nothing other than the quantum vacuum and its excitations. It's a linguistic need to label the root of nature. I understand your point, but ultimately you have to come to the root of nature if you're a monist. The only way to escape that is to be a dualist or a trialist like Stuart Hameroff. So we need to give a word to that root, and that root is not codified according to a contrast. That root simply is what is, whatever it may be.
Right. I mean, okay. The point I'm making, it's a little bit more than just an analytic point, but it's more epistemological. That is to say, what I'm saying here is that if you don't have a contrasting term, you can't give a definition to something. It doesn't mean that we can't say, yeah, like there's something that we're pointing to, there's some kind of convergence there, whatever, but we can't, it becomes unknowable. And this is something I would argue is the problem even for materialism. It's a problem for any monism whatsoever. The ultimate, the arche, right, it becomes self-unknowable.
Sure.
I agree 100% with what you said. I think you cannot give... See, the ontological primitive is by definition unknowable, except for its behavior, right? It's the definition of an ontological primitive. How do we explain one thing? We explain one thing in terms of another, and then we explain this other thing in terms of yet another. You can't go on down this line forever. At some point, you hit rock bottom. And after you make the last step of explanation, you fall onto the ontological primitive, and the ontological primitive simply is. So consciousness, in my view, simply is. We do not know the nature of the experiencer because there is nothing to contrast it to. So we cannot give it a definition in terms of properties. There is no property characterization.
Represent it and then get at it, at its ontology comprehensively in the same way perhaps that you can't say red a million times and then get to the experience or the qualitative aspect of what redness is in
for
actuality.
you can't characterize the properties of something unless you contrast it to something else. You cannot characterize positive charge without negative charge. You cannot even characterize movement without a stat reference framework. So I'm not trying to characterize consciousness by attributing properties to it. I use the term consciousness as a pointer to a fundamental unknowable. All we can know are the excitations of consciousness, because those are experiences. I'm basically defining experience as the excitations of that primitive, that unknowable primitive called consciousness. And those experiences can then be characterized in terms of their properties, because there are many patterns of vibration that lead to diversity. But consciousness itself is just a label, a pointer. We are pointing at something and saying, there is that. There is that which experiences, that is entailed by the existence of experience. And if I take it as the primitive, I cannot characterize it in terms of its properties. I can only know its manifestations. At best, I can intuitively infer something about it, because it is exciting itself according to this world and not according to another world. So there is something about it that leads to this around here right now, and not to something else. And I may point to those basic templates of excitation. I may refer to them as archetypes, which follows pretty neatly according to the definition of archetypes or analytical psychology. Templates, empty templates. But I agree with you that we cannot keep...
Probably what Plato would call form, right, Chris?
Template would be, for instance, a diamond formed according to a certain symmetrical template of atomic arrangements. But that template exists independent of there being a diamond. It's empty. It's just a template.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty much the same as what Plato would call the forms. They're
correct. The Platonic forms is another word for archetypes. There are several words in history referring to that. But I am with Chris that the implication of what I am saying, if consciousness is the ontological primitive, I not to give an account of consciousness in terms of its properties, because I have no reference of comparison. But that applies for any ontological primitive. It applies for the quantum vacuum. It applies for the brains of M theory. You cannot give a property account of them other than to characterize their behavior, their excitations.
Yeah, it ultimately, it has to become circular in the end. But I think there's also there's one difficulty there, and maybe, I mean, as long as you flush it out and you make that clear, I don't really see it as a problem. But because you could get into a danger of equivocation, you know, when you say, for instance, okay, it's that which experiences, and if I say, well, okay, well, what do we mean by experience? I mean, either you have to say, well, that which experiences means something different than consciousness, or it's the same. If it's the same, then obviously it's circular, which isn't necessarily a problem, because, you know, as you said, well, yes, of course, monism is going to be circular. The arche is going to be undefinable, right?
I don't think it's circular. Yeah.
Well, I mean, isn't any axiom? I mean, any axiom is going to have. I mean, it's an assumption in the sense.
Yeah, any basal assumption. Right? I think you are going to refer to that for the uniformity and the similarity. Like, so you have to refer to that to account for both similarity and dissimilarity. If you're going to.
Circularity suggests that one is begging the question, that one is making an assumption.
No, I think there's a difference. For example, something can be self-referential, like a definition. You know what I mean? So you can define something, but you can be justified in believing that based on your immediate experience of it. You know what I mean? So I can say, you know, but if you were to beg, I think begging the question becomes fallacious only when you create a relationship, a contingent relationship between two things, whereby, okay, the apple is on the table, you know what I mean?
I understand.
But it could not be on the table. But I'm saying it.
I got your point. So let me. I'm going to try to put it in terms that everybody can understand. Water is not ripples. Yet there is nothing to ripples but water. So when I say that consciousness is that which experiences, I don't think it's circular for exactly the same reason. Consciousness is not experiences for the same reason that water is not ripples. Water is not its behavior. It is the ontological ground of its behavior. Consciousness is the ontological ground of experiences. But but it's not experiences themselves. Yet there is nothing to experiences but consciousness, for the same reason that there is nothing to ripples but water. So I don't think it's circular, if you follow my
I get what you're saying.
analogy.
Yeah, I'm thinking of more in the epistemological sense that it's like, if ultimately, and this is a big if, I mean, if the data can be accounted for equally, and it depends on what we mean by account for, because I think, one of these debates about consciousness, I think, as many have pointed out, really, strike to the heart of not only of views, ontologies like materialism, but also science, because, arguments like Nick Bostrom or, the simulation argument, or, we could be in the matrix, brain in the vat, etc. We could go on for days with all these hypotheticals, but they reveal something about the nature of our experience, which is highlighted also. You come to see this if you go back, a little bit in time to, when pragmatism was coming into conception, with instrumentalism, right? So, when science inevitably has a limitation insofar as there's always going to be a general level that you could postulate some explanation, right, within the confines of strictly a scientific epistemology, right? There's always going to be some explanation that you could postulate that could explain the data at a more general level. That could be, for all we know. We can always do that. So if that's true, that we can always do that, then that means that science is necessarily limited in scope, which, the instrumentalists argue, and I think I would agree with them, that what science gives us is pragmatic knowledge, insofar as theories are useful instruments for predicting our experience, whatever experience means, right? That experience is a loosely defined term here. So with that said, if you have a starting point, you say, well, it's all consciousness, and somebody says, well, it's all matter. I mean, on a strictly scientific explanation, maybe your experience might be argued, or your ontology might be a little bit more internally consistent. I think you would argue, because you would say, I don't need to, I don't have a hard problem. That's just dissolved once you change the vocabulary, right? And that, the materialist does, or maybe the dualist has a interaction problem or something along those lines, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, that they still can pragmatically explain the data more or less equivalently.
I think science is about modeling and therefore predicting the patterns and regularities observable in nature. It is instrumentalist in its very essence, and therefore it is the basis of technology. From that instrumentalist perspective, I think you're correct. You can always postulate a more general framework behind what we directly experience, and then something behind that, and ad infinitum, infinite regress. But we don't do that because there is a point in which it's no longer useful. We no longer need to postulate as though entities, nature behaves as though this and that existed, or as though this other thing that existed behind those. At some point, it's not useful anymore. It doesn't enhance your predictive power, your modeling degrees of freedom anymore. So we don't do that. But from an ontology perspective, and now I'm moving from the pragmatic applications of engineering, substantiated by science, and moving on to our felt understanding of the nature of the world, ourselves, and our lives, which is what gives us meaning or lack thereof, purpose or lack thereof, and completely influences how we feel about the world and how we behave towards the world in our society, economy, politics, and so on. From that deeper, more fundamental philosophical perspective about understanding the nature of what is, as opposed to simply building toys and other more important technological artifacts such as cures for diseases and so on. From that deeper philosophical, ontological perspective, I would say that what I'm doing is precisely eliminating as many of these as though levels of explanation, more general frameworks behind what we can directly experience as possible. Ultimately, you will always have to acknowledge consciousness. Whatever it is the basic datum of existence. We are conscious. That's how it starts. When you're a 5-year-old kid and you have no models of reality, no theories, you only have the qualities of experience, the excitations of consciousness. What I'm trying to do is to eliminate the need to postulate something behind that, an instrumentalist approach that's actually taken to be an ontology, as opposed to simply an as-though model to allow you to model nature.
Right.
Materialism has grown into a philosophy. Materialists are now saying, physicalists are now saying, this is what reality is. Your consciousness is an epiphenomenon of arrangements of matter. This is no longer instrumentalist. This is now ontology.
Right.
And my argument is we don't need that intermediary step. Consciousness is the basic datum of reality. We can explain all reality as the excitations of consciousness taken as the ontological primitive. And then I escape the hard problem, not with the trick of language, but by solving the trick of language that created the hard problem in the first place.
Right. I would definitely agree that the relationship between what you would call the image of a process in consciousness and consciousness itself is one that consciousness initiates. It reaches towards the excitation versus the excitation establishing that. So
that's your intentionality.
I would definitely agree with the direction in which causality flows, but at the same time, I think perhaps the only distinction I would make between you and I, Bernardo, is that our position is that I do affirm that there is a ontological parallel to consciousness that is almost like a flip side to the coin, which is a substrate that gets excited, whether or not, because you could still say that substrate is consciousness, but it is consciousness looking at itself through the eyes, through an aspect where it sees qualities, but that, and then it flips back and it looks at itself through the eye of how things behave. You know what I mean? And what it seems to be doing is oscillating between this dual aspect mode of perception that it makes about what its own ontology is. If that makes any sense.
Can I comment on that? Yeah. Because we live under a physicalist cultural narrative for 200 or 300 years now, it's very deeply ingrained in our minds, this separation between behavior and observation. We think that there is behavior and there is an observation of that behavior, and these two things are separate. They can coincide depending on the circumstances, but they are fundamentally separate. If consciousness is the ontological primitive, this distinction is artificial. Behavior is observation. There's nothing to behavior but what we call the observation of that behavior. The behavior does not exist unless being observed by some aspect of consciousness, even if it's not your personal dissociated alter of consciousness. And that's important. If we can get out of this linguistic trap that we are so used to, separating behavior and observation, it goes a long way. There is no observer separate from that which is observed. The observed being the behavior. The behavior is already the observation. And what there can be are layers of dissociation, which leads to this impression that there is an objective world outside you. That world is indeed outside you as a dissociated cognitive process in consciousness, but it's not outside consciousness.
Right. It doesn't. Itself. It's not outside at the very least, it's not outside the sensitivity scope of consciousness at large. Is what you would say. Even if some aspects of it are obfuscated or hidden or
correct. Correct. I want to avoid an ontological jump. What I'm doing, you see, if we're not solipsists, we have to infer something to explain the world. You can only stick to your own personal observations to explain everything if you're a solipsist. If you're not a solipsist, you're bound to make an inference. But you have two options for that inference. You can make an ontological jump, which is I infer another type of substance. I infer something outside and independent of consciousness. Or you can say consciousness itself extends beyond the face value boundaries of my personal self. which implies then a dissociation process within consciousness.
Sure.
I want to stick to this latter one. I want to say that the Earth extends beyond the horizon, but I don't want to say that there is anything other than the Earth. I want to say that the consciousness extends beyond the horizon of my personal self, but I don't want to say that there exists anything beyond consciousness, because that's much more inflationary. It requires a whole new ontological class, as opposed to the extrapolation of an ontological class known to exist, because it's the basic datum of existence. It's where it all starts. It's our awareness.
Now, do you make a differentiation between ontology and modality? So, meaning, do you make a distinction between the fact that something might perhaps always be in a necessary relationship with another thing, and then the fact that that thing still might not be identical to that thing? So what I mean, for example, is this. Say, for example, there's this sort of all-pervasive state of consciousness, and we can sort of characterize it as this sort of fish tank full of water, this isomorphic, omnidirectional, landscape of liquid. And I drop a penny in that water. Now, this penny is being experienced by this liquid. Do you make a distinction between the fact that the penny is not identical to the liquid, though the penny cannot exist outside of the liquid, because there's nothing outside of the liquid? I think there's a distinction perhaps to be made there, where that even though it cannot exist outside of the liquid, it does have an ontology such that it doesn't reduce to the liquid. Because if you could say it does reduce to the liquid, then you would essentially be saying that matter is mind in some sense. Does that make sense?
I'm saying that. So you're basically defending a dual aspect monist view, if I understand you.
Right.
Okay. I think the water in the fish tank is consciousness itself, and there is no fish tank. There is only the water. Right. I think experiences are ripples and other movements of that water, currents, whirlpools, ripples. The coin, I don't think it exists. You allude to the coin as a source of energy to excite the water. I think the source of that excitation is internal. It's the intrinsic nature of the water to vibrate, to get excited. It's internal motion. Dual aspect monism comes very handy sometimes when we want to make a distinction between experiences that are fundamentally private, personal, like thoughts and emotions, and experiences that are shared, such as perceptions, sight, hearing, vision. Through reporting, we seem to agree that we are all perceiving the same world, but our thoughts and emotions tend to be very private. There seems to be a fundamental distinction between the two. One seems to come from outside and be shared through observation. The other seems to be internally generated and therefore intrinsically private. Dual aspect monism comes handy there, because then you can say there is only consciousness, but there are two aspects. There is the extrinsic aspect, perception, and there is the intrinsic aspect, thoughts and emotions. I don't think that is necessary. This is an involved argument. I don't think we will be able to tackle it
no problem.
sufficiently here. But just to give you the conclusion, I think perceptions can be reduced to thoughts and emotions if we deploy the idea of dissociation.
Okay. Could you
dissociation?
Yeah. No, I was going to ask you
dissociation.
What you mean by dissociation.
Dissociation is a well-known phenomenon in psychology. For instance, people with dissociative identity disorder will manifest multiple personalities that sometimes hate each other and want to kill each other. Dissociation means that parts of your cognitive space become disconnected from other parts. So one dissociated alter, as it's technically called, We have a certain set of memories, a certain personality, certain tendencies to be or to act in certain ways, goals, styles of communication. Other authors will have completely different memories, and they will not be associated with each other. There will not be, there is no unification, as in the unification problem in psychology. There is no unification between these different cognitive spaces, so they acquire their own illusory identities. It's all one person, but there seems to be multiple personalities within that one person who have their own sense of identity. Now, this is not, this has been confirmed very recently in 2014 and 2015 scientifically. People have put patients with dissociative identity disorder in functional brain scanner, and we see that dissociated processes have a very particular image that was compared with actors simulating multiple personalities, trying to convince themselves that they had multiple personalities, but the fingerprint on the brain scanner was different. And also doctors in Germany studied a woman who had alters that claimed to be blind, not be able to see, and alters that could see. And they hooked this woman up to a EEG. And when a blind alter was in control of the woman's body, there was no electric signature in the visual cortex. The normal brain activity associated with vision was not there at all, even though the woman had her eyes wide open while they were taking the measurement. And when an alter with normal sight was in control, that activity returned. So dissociation is a real phenomenon with literally blinding abilities. Dissociation can literally blind you. And it comes when different cognitive spaces do not evoke each other. What is life but a series of experiences that evoke one another? A sight evokes a thought, which evokes an emotion, which evokes an action, which evokes another perception, which evokes another thought and another emotion, and so on. When this evocative link is broken between internally connected cognitive spaces, you have dissociation.
You have partitions now, which can act almost individually. Be considered an individual person, perhaps in a localized way. Right.
They acquire a false sense of separate identity. But these are just mental contents that happen not to evoke each other through an associative link. They become dissociated. You can experience that when you forget things, or when you suppress your emotions when you go to work. Your emotional life, your love life may be in disarray, and you go to work and you park that in order to work correctly. There you go. You've become dissociated from that aspect of your mental life. Now, the point I'm making is that there is only universal consciousness. And individual creatures, living creatures, life, biology itself, is the image of dissociative processes in consciousness. Whirlpools in the stream, you feel, localizations, dissociative alters in consciousness. That's what life is. It's an image of that. And my claim is that, to return to the analogy of going to work and parking your problems, even if you successfully park your emotional life, your conscious attitude is still indirectly influenced by it. You may be more stressed out, you may make wrong choices, you may be locked into vicious patterns of logical thinking while you're dissociated from your emotions, but they still exert an influence. My claim
underlying
is that
pressure, like probably what Jung would call like complexes, that kind of that shadow that seeps in the background that kind of bubbles up, you know, when you put it out too much, where it's still inside your causal connection of consciousness, but you've intentionally sort of, you know, separated it from
repressive.
Exactly.
Yeah. So in Jungian terminology, a complex in the unconscious would percolate up and influence your ego's attitude without you being aware of what that causal influence actually coming from. You feel it indirectly without becoming aware of the complex itself. I don't like the word unconscious. I like to use the expression obfuscated.
Right. I
don't think there is anything outside consciousness. So my point is, what we call the inanimate empirical world is basically the thoughts and emotions in universal consciousness that fall outside the boundaries of our particular dissociated alters. And biology has evolved to pick up on this subtle causal connection of thought and emotions outside your dissociated alter, like your emotional life that you repress while you're at work, to pick up on that, amplify, and give it a different qualitative spin in order to allow us to perceive it better.
Right.
The result of that is what we call the sense organs. It's our eyes, our ears, and what we perceive is basically the extrinsic image of non-dissociated processes in universal consciousness. And other people and other animals, other plants, living creatures are the images of other dissociated alters in consciousness, the way other whirlpools in the stream look like when our whirlpool looks at them.
Right,
through
exactly.
this through the
constraints of our ripples and how, and that obviously like gives rise. I think the implications of our views are pretty much identical. Like, I definitely agree that consciousness is an ontological primitive, at least in relation to space-time. But I do hold like a dual aspect view, where I do think that there are such things as forms for any practical purpose, whereby you have these abstract objects, you have this concrete sub object, but the unifying principle of both of those things is consciousness, because both things can't perceive each other. Both things are causally effete. It may even be the case at a higher, more transcendent state that those things are consciousness, like they reduce to what Plato would call the form of the good or something like that. But I think that when they can only be experienced or imposed on each other in consciousness. So you can only have space-time in consciousness. You can only have change. And I think from there on, the implications are the same. You have this substrate of consciousness that becomes localized in particular ways, whereby it's localizing particular attributes of things and using those particular attributes to experience the world external to it, but still in consciousness, if that makes sense. Yeah, so
I sympathize with what you're saying. I don't think it requires dual aspects. Let me tell you first why I sympathize. What you call Platonic forms, I would call the universal archetypes of consciousness. Consciousness vibrates in a certain way and not others. Otherwise, our universe would be basically a blank. It would be an interference pattern of everything that can vibrate in whatever way it can conceivably vibrate, and there would be nothing. So it vibrates in this way and not another. This way is what we call our universe, our laws of physics, the way this universe behaves, as opposed to how it could be conceived to behave. So it does this and not something else because it has some archetypal templates intrinsic to it. Yeah, there is something about it intrinsically. There is something intrinsic about this primitive called consciousness that leads it. There's an intrinsic template that leads it to vibrate this way and not another, according to this pattern and not another. You can call those Platonic forms. I can call them archetypes.
Right.
I'm sure there are other names we can apply. But I don't see the forms or the archetypes as ontologically distinct from consciousness. And I also don't see the need to postulate a dual aspect, monist approach to it, although I acknowledge it's very tempting. And I actually would settle on it to dual aspect monism if I didn't think that we could reduce still one of the aspects to the other, as I just tried to describe. I think we can reduce perception to thoughts and emotions. And then we get rid of the dual aspect. I have, and this is about me, parsimony is an extremely important value for me. I think it's very important. It's subjective, but I think it's very important that if we can explain things in a more parsimonious way than another, then the more parsimonious way is to be preferred. If we don't do that, we are lost into the many layers of generalization that Chris has just talked about. We get into Nick Bostrom's advanced civilization that is simulating us, and then there is another one that is simulating them, and we get a million others simulating each other.
Brains and bats and brains and bats. Yeah.
There you go. So if you want to avoid that, there is no good reason to stop in the middle. You either go all the way, or you say, no, I stop at the fundamental datum of existence with it, which is consciousness itself, and I will resist even the dual aspect to that. But that's my subjective.
Sure. I think in many ways, at least for all practical purposes, our views are in many ways identical. Like I wouldn't say that particulars or even the substrate exists outside the scope of consciousness potentially. You know what I mean? I think consciousness has the ability to interact with it in localized ways and also withhold that But Chris, did you want to? I did want to jump into a few things and then look at your view and say, okay, well, what are the implications in science and in psychology and things like that? But before we jump in that direction, I wanted to see if Chris had anything to add to that last line of thought. If you had anything you wanted to.
Yeah, actually, something that was coming up in chat. Somebody was asking about this, and it seems to me clear to me what you're saying, Bernardo. But I just wanted to, one, make sure that is true, and also maybe hopefully to clarify for the other people out there, which is, we talked before about the observer or the self, and at the same time, you're also talking about, on your view, consciousness is kind of like the guitar string that vibrates. And then, so for instance, the wall that I'm looking at, the computer that I'm looking at, the chair that I'm sitting in, all of these things are consciousness, and also what I think of as myself, right? My emotions, thoughts, all of that. That's also all consciousness. So all of it, anything I could name, anything I could talk about, anything I could point to, including myself at any way we want to slice this up, it's all consciousness. Yet at the same time, we do demarcate the line between, myself and what's not myself. So somebody had mentioned Eastern thought, and that they said that, they thought your perspective was very Western insofar as you were talking about an observer. And I said, well, I don't know if he's talking about an observer in the sense of like an ego personality or something like that, like a Cartesian ego, something. He doesn't be saying that. 'Cause the chair, you would say, is consciousness. That obviously refutes that idea, but maybe I thought you could just clarify that a little bit more so people would understand.
Yeah. I think there's only one subject in the universe, and that subject is the entire universe, and that's universal consciousness. And what we call our personal selves are illusions, in the sense that the dissociated alters don't really exist in themselves. If you found a person with dissociative identity disorder claiming this morning that she is a 4-year-old boy, and in the evening that she is a 62-year-old policeman, and a woman sometime at noon, you would know that these different personalities are illusions. They are experienced as real. The person is sincere in what the person is reporting, but it's merely the effect of dissociation. I think our personal selves, Bernardo Kastrup, is an illusion. It's the reflection of a dissociated pattern of thinking and perception. It doesn't really exist.
Do you mind just clarify what you mean by illusion, and then you can adjust on that and then continue? Because many people would equate illusion to mean not real, where I would just see illusion as just being an emergent localization. Because you're still using the same ontological categories, but they're just being localized. So they're not any less real. They're just being bundled in a way that they're isolated.
Correct.
So and also one other thing on the illusion point, to call the self or consciousness an illusion would still seem to imply that it's a real illusion. There's something, and you can expand on that in a little bit more detail.
Consciousness is not an illusion. It's the only thing that isn't an illusion. It's the only thing that there is. Everything we see are excitations of consciousness, the one thing that exists. But this one subject, this one self with capital S, I'm trying to speak a little bit Eastern language because Chris said that it was somebody in the chat referring to Eastern philosophy. That self, capital S, that universal consciousness is the only thing there is. What is an illusion is the idea that we exist as separate conscious individuals from the rest. That separation from the rest is an illusion. But the experience of separation, by definition, isn't an illusion because we experience it. Experience is real as such. It's the moment that you try to give an explanation to that experience as something fundamentally true. That's where things go wrong. I think it is an illusion to consider personal identity fundamentally true. Personal identity exists only as an experience within universal consciousness, as a pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving, and perceiving. So that's the context in which I used the word illusion. I don't see fundamental reality to the personal self. I think it's a process of localization within the one fundamental reality, which is the universal self with capital S, or universal consciousness. To address the question about Eastern philosophy more directly, I indeed came at this from a Western perspective, a perspective driven by logic, parsimony, and empirical honesty, and so on. Having arrived at the formulation of my philosophy, however, I have been confronted by many people, friends, readers, acquaintances, with questions about how it measures up with Eastern philosophy. And if you take account of the language differences and establish honest bridges between the different uses of terminology, like in the East, they use the word mind in a very specific sense as intellectual thinking, while I use the word mind as interchangeable with consciousness, which is the Western tradition. So if you take that into account, personally, I have not found any way in which Eastern non-dual philosophies, as articulated in the Upanishads and more modern Eastern philosophers like Mahana Maharshi or Nisargadatta Maharaj, I have not seen any fundamental difference between what they are saying and what I'm saying.
I would agree.
There may be, but I haven't found it.
Right.
After taking into account the differences in language.
Correct. So there's something else that seems to flow from this idea that you're putting forward. Is that in many ways, if we are sort of a localization of consciousness at large, where our external expression and consensus reality as all of us experiencing something, we in many ways are experiencing the thoughts and expressions of a higher tiered mind collectively. And when we think and dream ourselves, we are sort of doing the same thing that in many ways the universal consciousness is doing, but just in a localized way. How do you think that's so we are in many ways we're creating a small universe in our mind when we think and imagine. So how does that go against the common idea in materialism? Because it seems like in many ways the materialist and the physicalist position is referring to matter and scale and proportion as being objective. But in many ways, if these things are objective, it's almost like when I have a dream and I dream of a large building that might be bigger than my head, it would make sense that that building would just explode my head or something like that. If scale is objective, you know what I mean? So it does make sense that it is a perception within a perception, like there's an inception going on. What are your thoughts on how that relates to the materialist paradigm?
Curtis, I think the way you articulated the question has the answer. You nailed it. It is the nature of consciousness to dream things up. As dissociated alters of consciousness, we inherit the nature of consciousness. Why? Because we are it. A dissociated alter is nothing but consciousness, in the same way that a whirlpool is nothing but water. It is our fundamental nature to dream things up. When we disconnect from the parameters of consensus, like when we dream while we sleep at night,
or have a hallucination,
or have a schizophrenic hallucination, mind is just doing what it does. It's following its nature, which is to vibrate, to generate experiences. And in a dream, we always have a localized point of view within the dream, as if the dream, the environment of the dream, were enveloping us. Guess what? This is what's happening right now. And yet, obviously, this is all within our consciousness. Consciousness now is just doing what it does. It's just now, while we are awake, we are plugged into the stream within which many whirlpools are circling. And we have access to what's going on in the stream through our sense organs. When that access is closed during sleep, the whirlpool keeps on generating its own ripples, because that's the nature of water. That's the nature of consciousness.
Yeah, awesome.
You see, just to close on the part, because you also asked me how does that measure up with materialism and physicalism. Physicalism is consciousness abstracting something within itself, namely matter outside consciousness, and then pointing at its own abstraction within itself and saying, I am that.
Right.
That's basically what it is. It's funny, it's consciousness pointing at its own, one of its own pointers and saying, have its own
right.
abstractions and saying, I am that. And then we get all surprised when we can't solve the hard problem of consciousness.
Right, exactly. Because we say, I'm that, and I'm not, and I'm using what I actually am fundamentally to refer or represent.
Yes.
And it's
we are projecting ourselves
onto something else.
Yeah, we project ourselves onto our own abstractions, and then we get surprised when we can't explain ourselves starting from our own abstractions.
Right.
But there's going to inevitably be a limitation there, because back to what we were talking about with monism, because you see, you can't at the same time observe yourself, right, and also get an objective picture, right? You can't, because inevitably if you say, well, I am that, but that is a part of you, right? That doesn't work. There's you have to remember that there's this, and I think that's one point to stress for the people out there listening, is that in saying that everything is consciousness, that does carry an epistemological limitation of definition. It becomes impossible to give an exact definition. But of course, we need to remember that the same is true for any monist claim, whether it be materialism or something else. If you say that all that exists is something, whatever that is, you think it's consciousness, you think it's energy, whatever you want to say, whatever that stuff is, if that's all there is, you're going to run into that same problem over and over again, because then any attempt to define it is going to be a manifestation of the same thing that you're trying to define. Hence, you can't ultimately define it.
Right.
I agree with you. If I can add to that, Chris, just briefly, we cannot give a relative characterization of an ontological primitive under any monist system. The ultimate under any monist system cannot be characterized in terms of its properties in relation to something else, because it's all there is. But we can make or create two other forms of definition. One is an operational definition, in which you actually avoid defining what you're pointing to, but you define it in terms of its behavior or manifestation. That's what I do. I say consciousness is that which experiences, or consciousness is that whose vibrations are experiences. In defining it this way, I'm attributing nothing to consciousness. I'm characterizing it as the source of the behavior, which in turn I can attribute properties to.
Right, that's what I see. I see you making a relationship between its causal influence, its scope of experience, but there does seem in many ways an aspect where you're saying that from consciousness's end, there's an image which it sees itself distinct from, but globally you're saying that it's all one thing, namely consciousness.
When you say consciousness experiences itself or sees itself, I think that's very particular to human beings. We are capable of self-reflection. We are capable to turn contents of our consciousness into objects of other contents of our consciousness. In other words, we are capable of thinking about our thoughts.
And representing,
we are capable of pondering our emotions. But this is not the only form of consciousness.
Right.
Actually, I think this is unique to humans and therefore very, very, very limited. I think other animals will live in a kind of flow in which experience, non-self-reflective, non-reflexive, in which experience simply flows and is experienced instinctively. You're just in the flow of that experience, but you're not self-reflective about it. From that perspective of an instinctive flow of experiences, consciousness is not looking at itself and asking, what am I? Consciousness is just vibrating. That's all there is.
Right.
It's just being.
It's seeing things what they are and experiencing and enjoying. And it might have the emotional roller coasters that go along with it at the same time.
Yes. Yeah, it perceives, it feels, it may even make some inferences, but it's not taking its thoughts as an object of its own thoughts and going into consciousness is not folding in upon itself. I think folding in upon itself
becomes intellectual, becomes more rational.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and that's, I think, is a configuration of consciousness that is particular to human beings. And what we call the neurocorrelates of consciousness are the image of this configuration alone, not anything else. Because you see, when we study the neurocorrelates of consciousness, we need two essential ingredients. One is objective measurements of brain activity through a functional brain scanner. And the other one is what the subject reports, because that's the only access we have to subjectivity. The subject will only report what he's aware of being aware of.
Sure.
The subject will not report everything he's aware of. He will only report that subset of the contents of his awareness of which he's aware of being aware.
Correct.
You don't report that you're conscious of this unless you're conscious of being conscious of it. So what we call the neurocorrelates of consciousness are actually, in my view, the neurocorrelates of self-reflective awareness.
Right.
There's a lot more going on in consciousness that we experience, but we don't know that we experience, and therefore we don't report, and therefore they can't be studied.
Right. So within this scope, within this paradigm, let's just say what you're saying is true and accurate, and it's the most parsimonious position. You know, it's something that we should definitely take seriously, and there are probably some that are taking it seriously. What are the implications of this, both in rational thoughts, in psychology, and in the scientific paradigm that we experience today? How do we approach that, and what things might change or should change according to your view?
I think science, from an instrumentalist perspective, which is, I think, the core value of science, the enabler of technology, nothing changes. The theories are models. We postulate that things behave as though this and that were true because they allow us to predict things correctly. That can continue as it is. A different ontology, an alternative to physicalism, does not deny the predictive correctness of our models insofar as they work today. So we do not need a new physics because our ontology has changed. Actually, I would go as far as saying that the quantum vacuum under quantum field theory is what I call consciousness. I interpret that as consciousness. Or the universal brain of M theory is consciousness, the vibrations of which are the empirical world, which only exists insofar as it can be experienced. So that's the first point I want to make. I don't think scientific theories, I don't think physics needs to change as a result of a badly needed update of our cultural narrative, of our ontology. Now, many other things can change because they are not about predicting the behavior of inanimate matter. They are about how we subjectively, emotionally relate to ourselves, to reality, and the planet we occupy. I would like to say that if people really internalize the implications of this ontology, their behavior towards other human beings would drastically change, because now another person is yourself, is another dissociated outer of yourself. Their behavior towards the earth would change, because now the earth is the image of a cradle process in consciousness out of which our dissociated outers emerge. The earth is not separate from ourselves. Our attitude towards death would change, because now death is an expansion of consciousness.
That's a big one. I think I was going to ask you about that after you went through, so we could probably expand on that a bit also. But
I'll spend some time on it now. For the physicalist, death is the end of consciousness, because consciousness is conditional to particular arrangements of matter. Once those arrangements dissolve, it's the end of consciousness. For the formulation of idealism that I'm putting forward, death is the end of the whirlpool. Death is the end of the dissociation. What happens when dissociation ends? Your awareness broadens. You remember. Death is then a very broad remembrance, a reassociation, a reconnection with cognitive spaces that you've become alienated from during the course of your life. And if that is now the case, your whole perspective about the meaning and purpose of your life has changed, because under physicalism, if matter is all there is, there cannot be another conceivable purpose to life but the accumulation of material goods. And there is no justification to think about how things will go on 100 years from now, because you will be dead.
Exactly.
You would not be there to care. So we pillage the planet, we plunder, we basically become psychotic criminals in a historical and earth-wide context.
Driven by the materialist paradigm where we want to attain more of what is our ontological foundation, and the more of that we have, the more value we place upon ourselves, because we are now a bigger collection of these material objects than you are. Right.
And even though you're going to leave all that behind when you die, there is no other conceivable meaning to your life while you're alive, because physicalism closes the door on any broader perspective in time and space. So that would change too. So that's now my ethical idealist wish, that these would be the changes. If our cultural narrative would be updated as an idealist cultural narrative today instead of physicalist, I would like to believe these would be immediately the consequences. In honesty, though, I don't think they would be the consequences immediately. What I think would happen is that a different cultural narrative would give people intellectual permission. People would give themselves intellectual permission to be open to different kinds of direct personal experiences that today they do have glimpses of, but they dismiss and they immediately close the door on.
Right. You're just crazy.
To give you concrete,
right.
You're just crazy, so we just dismiss that. For instance, the funny cognitive landscapes we traverse just after orgasm, or the very interesting thoughts and perceptions we have on the edge of sleep, when you're falling asleep or when you're waking up, especially when it's an afternoon nap. Very funny things happen there. Or the vistas and perspectives we have in deep states of meditation. The way you look at psychedelic trances. There are many examples. We have glimpses of these things today, and we close the door on them because what can it be? As just chemicals, or it's just the delusions of an indulged organism, or it's just dreams, or it's just crazy wiring in my brain on the edge of sleep.
We underestimate
not working very well.
Right? We don't evaluate them.
Exactly. So now if we have a different cultural narrative, we give ourselves intellectual permission to explore these glimpses, to keep these doors open. And then we may reach some personal experiences that in turn will really be transformative. I don't think a narrative in itself, an intellectual understanding, a grokking of what's going on, is transformative in itself.
Right.
You need a direct personal experience.
Behind just the describing of something.
Exactly. It remains intellectual. So you might say, well, then we don't need the new cultural narrative because it's just a model anyway. It's just a lecture anyway. No, we do need, because the new narrative will give us permission to open the doors, to become, to create the conditions, the
right.
potential for a direct transformative personal experience. And that's from where I think that the greatest change will come from.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely agree with that. I think it's very insightful. I think that even though at present there are those that literally fight tooth and nail against some of these ideas, and it doesn't necessarily seem though it's because of the implications on the foreground. I mean, I think that's the persona that's put out there. It's like, I'm going to take the evidence at wherever it leads. But in some sense, I don't think that's actually what is happening. And that might be for various reasons, for lack of knowledge, for how you've been brought up, your current colleagues and your surroundings, that grant that I might need to get. And it's something that happens on both the spiritual side, where people ground themselves in the relationship and the authority that they've established in their community, such that it makes their ability to genuinely evaluate their position harder, because now if I change my mind on this, where does my paycheck come from, or where does this next grant, So I think when if the narrative is taken seriously, I think that's the first step for sure. And then when people start collectively taking these on in a broad way and addressing it publicly, that confidence just builds. And I do think it is inspirational in the sense that when you do realize that you and I are ontologically indistinguishable, but are particularly different, we become unified by our ontological basis, and we understand that there's something that unifies us. Thereby, it does make sense to say, whatever I do to you, I should do it such that it wouldn't be disconcerting for you to do it to me. That makes sense now. There's an ontological basis for that, not just a hand waving of a rule that we should use because it makes it more practical. And now it makes it a little bit more internal. I agree.
I think we shouldn't adopt the ontology because it is inspirational.
Right.
We should adopt the ontology because it's true, or at least it's the best explanation that we can come up with. I also don't think that we need to bring on board what is maybe wrongly called evidence of the paranormal to make this transition, because I don't think the physicalist ontology explains the normal. To the extent that it doesn't explain the qualities of experience, it explains nothing, because the qualities of experience is all we have. So I also don't think we need to bring in the paranormal into the story. It's about explaining the normal, the ordinary, the everyday experience. And the physicalism does a very poor job at that. So I think we should adopt a new narrative because it explains the normal better. It explains more. It explains it more parsimoniously in a way that's more logically consistent and more empirically honest. This is the sole reason we should adopt it. Having said that, once we adopt it, it does open many other doors, and there will be many implications which happen to be largely positive. I don't think they're purely positive, though, and I'll make a personal confession to you. My death anxiety has increased. I used to be a materialist by default. In other words, I used to assume that there was no other better game in town than materialism without really thinking about it. I used to work at CERN in Switzerland. You know, that's the church of, that's the cathedral, St. Peter's Basilica of materialism. And I was there, you know. 22 years old, I went there. You know, I was a kid. It was my first job. And my dream come true. And I was there in the mid to late 90s. And I was a materialist by default. My death anxiety was little because there is literally nothing to fear about death under physicalism. There's nobody there to fear or to suffer or to worry or to be in pain. It's the end of all of your problems, all of your stresses, all of your suffering. It has your problems have a shelf life under physicalism. Not only that, there is a handy exit button. If things really get bad, you can get out of it. Eject. Now that I see, emotionally, my relationship with my own philosophical position is complicated. There is a part of me that doesn't like it at an emotional level, because now death is an unknown. When you broaden consciousness, the good and the bad come into that broader scope, if you know what I mean. And anybody can have a direct experience of that once you become aware of your own inner demons. That's a broadening of consciousness as well. It doesn't feel very good at all.
So it's almost like that psychological entanglement sort of is retained as the body goes away, and it's like the experiences are become just vivid. It's like you just enter that nightmare, and there's no quarantine between your imagination and your thought and the experience of it, whereby in your physical body, you know, you have that extra layer of constraint to actually say, okay, I don't want to think about that, and I can go back to the external world.
It's over.
Whereas internally, you're like, oh my gosh, every thought is like, you know, immediate, and it's like, you know, and there's an extra level of.
And you see, I do believe that if you attain through direct experience, not through indirections, not through intellectual narratives and intellectual models, which are very fine and good, but only through a direct experience of oneness, I think your anxiety can really disappear. And I have had glimpses of that direct experience of oneness, but by and large, my position regarding oneness is one derived from logic, empirical honesty, and parsimony. So I lack that direct experience that would dissolve anxiety. And to the extent that I lack that, I do fear the experiential unknown we call death.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I do want to open up the floor for some questions before we wrap up. And then if you wanted to do some more and engage with anybody else beyond the time that we sort of allotted, we can definitely do that. I just don't want to be inconsiderate to your particular time.
I don't have a deadline right now, but my deadline would be when I need to go to the bathroom. Other than that, it's okay.
So what we can do is perhaps do the next half hour of just Q&A and get some people on here also, and perhaps address some of the questions in the side. And then I'll let you sort of initiate when you think it would be a good time to close, or if anybody wants to make, we can sort of probably put some barriers in place and then reconvene if we want to in a more open way. Chris, did you want to bring something up?
Yeah, and I think it'd be a good way to transition into that. Just some issues that were coming up in chat. You know, I've seen some comments, and you know, people were, you know, because I mean, I've seen a tendency. You know, and this is no offense to anybody at all. I'm just saying it's an observation. That's all it is. You know, I've seen a tendency, you know, in these kinds of debates between, you know, those that would hold the materialist position and those that hold some other position. There's many others, but I've seen the kind of debates where it's like, you'll see some people will say, well, you're just holding that position because, this is, providing meaning and purpose in your life. And, in other words, it's a borderline ad hominem argument. It's basically saying, well, the only reason you believe this position is because somehow it gives you something psychologically, that it's a crutch or something along those lines, right? Which, right. Of course, even if that was the case, right, whatever your motive is would be completely irrelevant to the argument that you're giving, right? Your truth value, whether, because you've already given reasons, right? Reasons, not motives. There's a difference. Reasons for why you hold this position, why you think it's more logical, coherent, parsimonious, etc., right? But nonetheless, that doesn't mean you can't also talk about the ethical implications of the
exactly.
And of course, if you happen to like those ethical applications, well, that would be something that might be the case or might not be the case. Again, whether or not this is true and whether you hold it to be true, etc. Now, with that said, okay, people mention life after death, and I like to just interject with one thing that on materialism, the standard view is that there would be no continuance of consciousness whatsoever. But that's actually not entirely true. And I would join you, Bernardo, in your critiques of materialism and the hard problem is essentially insoluble. I would agree with you there, but I do just on the assumption that, let's say, there is no hard problem. Let's just play devil's advocate for the materialist here. Someone like Ray Kurzweil, for instance, he thinks that the universe. He takes kind of an omega point, almost kind of theory, right? That the universe is an evolving model, right, and it's evolving towards higher orders of complexity and connection. And his catchphrase is "God doesn't exist yet." And on his view, you can certainly entertain all sorts of wild ideas that for all we know, if Ray Kurzweil is correct, with everything doubling, Moore's law just going into infinity, eventually everything will be connected, and who knows, me and you will be back here having infinite, philosophical debates or whatever, essentially living forever. So, it's just, what I want to say is that, on all of these views generally, and when I say these views, I mean all of these various ontological definitions you could give. In other words, what you think exists, what do you think reality is fundamentally? All of these different views can account for afterlife or no afterlife, depending on how you splice it. So I think it's no offense to anyone, but I think it's the wrong direction to be looking for somebody's motives and to be focusing all your attention when you're entertaining someone who disagrees with you on thinking about what motives are for why they believe something, and instead just concentrate on the reasons. Whether or not you think they have motives, that's irrelevant. What are their reasons, and only talk about that. Forget about whether you think it helps them in their life or whatever. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. It doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with if they made an essay and they gave you, here's my points for why I think X is the case. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? Whether that makes me feel good or not doesn't matter anyway. That's all I wanted to say. Just one.
Can I comment?
That's an excellent point. Go for it, Bernardo.
First, I will agree completely with you. And then I will commit the sin of... I will commit the very sin that you just described in the interest of bringing balance to the discussion. It is a point I'm sensitive to, because I think, it will look like I would disagree with you, but I'm not. It is tricky for anyone, philosophers included, to really be self-reflectively cognizant of what is driving your thinking. It is very tricky. Sometimes you really catch yourself doing something for a motivation, not a reason, for a motivation that you were not aware of. It's a subliminal motivation. That said, if you really look from a psychological perspective into materialism, as it was originally called, so let's use the word materialism because now I'm referring to 19th century materialism, mid-19th century, when the materialist cultural narrative really began gathering steam with the materialist neo-Darwinian narrative began gathering steam. You can make a very interesting psychological analysis of that. I published an essay on my blog the other day about it. You see, the claim to objectivity that materialists make is the following. Materialism destroys all meaning and purpose in your life, in principle. New atheists would dispute that, but let's take that as an axiom. Materialism destroys all meaning and purpose. Therefore, if I am defending materialism, it's because I'm willing to face and stare the hard facts in the face. I'm a brave person, I'm courageous, and I'm basically acknowledging the facts, even though they destroy my meaning and purpose. That's the claim to fame. I think it is false. Under deeper analysis, according to meaning theory, meaning management, how is it called?
Like existential.
MMM.
Oh, okay.
No. I can tell you. I can give you the reference right now. The meaning maintenance model of social psychology, which was proposed in 2006 by two psychologists, and it has been empirically demonstrated for the past 10 years. We extract meaning from 4 different sources. Meaning and purpose for our lives. One is self-esteem. If you can differentiate yourself from the crowd, that gives you a sense of meaning. 2 is belonging. If you belong to something bigger than yourself, that gives you meaning. 3 is symbolic survival. You may die, but your work survives, your kids survive. That's a form of symbolic survival. And 4th, and most important, closure. Even when meaning is destroyed, because you're a teenager and your friends are putting you down at school, and you're failing, and your parents are treating you badly, and you have no perspective. If you have a model of nature that explains all that, you still find some meaning. Closure is very big in the meaning maintenance model. And what the theory says is that there is fluid compensation. When one of these 4 sources of meaning is taken away from you, you will compensate by emphasizing the other 3, or at least one of the other 3. And in my view, materialism is an expression of fluid compensation. At some point in the mid-19th century, we've lost our ability to relate to religious myths, religious symbolism, without scrutiny by the linear intellect. We started asking questions, but does this add up? Instead of taking it on board purely intuitively and emotionally, as we had done for thousands of years before, it became essential. The intellect became the bouncer of the heart. The intellect would scrutinize that before we would take that on board or not. So we lost our ability to relate to religion, and that's Nietzsche coming in. God is dead. The gay science, that represents the ethos, the
Right.
intellectual and emotional ethos of that era. And I think the intellectual elite of the time, the scientists and philosophers, they suffered a kind of ontological trauma, because as human beings, they also had to face death anxiety. And death anxiety, facing your mortality, is an enormous threat to meaning, as we know from terror management theory in psychology. So I think they fluidly compensated by emphasizing closure, self-esteem, and symbolic immortality. They lost transcendent meaning, but at least they would find a complete causally closed explanation for the universe, which gives you a sense of meaning. Self-esteem, by differentiating themselves from the ignorant masses, they knew better what the nature of reality was. And the masses, the religious masses, were ignorant. And symbolic immortality, through leaving behind esoteric modeling, esoteric scientific work about the nature of the whole universe. So I think materialism has motivations that are entirely related to the defense, maintenance, preservation of meaning.
Yeah.
Which is quite surprising.
Right, yeah.
Absolutely.
No, I agree 100%. And I agree with both of what Chris mentioned before, whereby when you are addressing someone's arguments, you understand that they have reasons in the stream of their motivations, but you don't necessarily have to appeal to their motivations. You can't appeal to their motivations to attack their reasons.
I agree.
And I think that's fallacious for sure. It's a classical genetic fallacy, sort of. Okay, this is how you developed your ideas, therefore they're false. No, I think if you want to be charitable and not try to misrepresent them just because, they came up with the existence of the flying spaghetti monster because they were angry one day, you know what I mean? That doesn't inhibit the idea of the fact that that could be the case, that they might have, good reasons for affirming that spaghetti and
Totally
meatballs
agree.
can do that. So let's bring in some people for questions. Did you want to take a quick hiatus, grab a water or anything like that?
No, let's go ahead. Let's go ahead.
Okay. All right. So if anybody wants to jump in for a question, feel free to.
There are several already. I can see them here.
Okay, so meanwhile, if someone doesn't want to kind of jump on and introduce himself, we can probably tackle some on the side. But anybody that wants to jump on and ask in person, and maybe perhaps do a little bit of dialogue, feel free to do so. So, what is the first question we have on the left? Let's see here. We have the Reverend Christopher asking, is consciousness mind?
I use the words consciousness and mind interchangeably because I think that is largely the Western tradition. In the East, they make a differentiation. In the East, consciousness is the more fundamental thing, and mind is usually could be translated as thoughts or the intellect, an abstract attempt to model the world and the self. But I use the words interchangeably. And I don't think consciousness emanates from a mind. I think consciousness emanates from nowhere. It's a primitive. It's what there is. Everything else arises from consciousness and in consciousness.
Right. I agree. What is the role of myth and religion in this new narrative? So that was asked by, I'm not going to go ahead and try to pronounce that because I value my reputation. but if you want to,
yeah, I'm just releasing a new book called More Than Allegory on religious myth. I have it here on religious myth, truth and belief, in which I tackle exactly this question. You see, I think a cultural narrative, an ontology, has to be based on values of logical consistency, empirical honesty, and parsimony. For changing and improving our cultural narrative and bringing it closer to truth, we do not need religious myths, and we should not have religious myths. But that cultural narrative, in my view, is a subset of what is really going on. It's the subset that can be corralled within the confines of language and linear logic. For one or another reason, a cultural narrative needs to be confined to those criteria, given our cultural ethos today. Otherwise, it wouldn't be taken seriously. Moreover, a cultural narrative is by definition something you need to communicate and share. So it has to be confined to language. The moment you confine it to language, you have a subset of what's going on. I think that subset is more, what we can do in that subset is more than enough to get rid of physicalism forever, because physicalism is also confined to that subset. We can do a much better job in that subset. But it is still a subset allowed for by language. And language entails the objective existence of space and time. We talk about past, present, and future. We conjugate our verbs according to these tenses. We have a separation between subject and object in language, a separation between action and the subject that undertakes the action. These are all built into language, a form of linear logic built into grammar. So these are the constraints of language. It's enough to change the cultural narrative, but for our own personal way of relating to the world, we can go further. And we can go further through religious mythology. Religious mythology, if understood as symbols that are pointing to something and not embodying literal, direct explanation of that something, which would basically render the religious myth redundant. If a literal explanation existed, we wouldn't need a religious myth. The religious myth is a symbol that precisely tries to go beyond what can be captured literally. It is pointing at something beyond space and time, pointing at something beyond the duality of subject and object. And that role, I think, is fundamental for the way we feel about ourselves, our lives, and the world where we are inserted. And I think the loss of our ability to relate symbolically to religious myths has been a tragedy whose effects we are still seeing manifested in the world today. And we lost this ability in two different ways. One, cynicism, denying religion altogether, and 2, fundamentalism and literalism, which is just as bad.
Right.
It denies the symbols just the same. It turns the whole thing into a sort of historical, literal tale, and completely devalues what the thing is pointing to. It ignores that equally. So I think both fundamentalism, literalism, and cynicism, atheistic cynicism, do harm to the original value of religious symbology, religious.
Yeah, excellent. I think there is
and I think
an importance to understanding things, the symbolism behind a particular idea and the relationship between those ideas and how they tie into what we experience or what we affirm as an ontological primitive. And I think the diversity of all these myths and narratives gives the span really of what consciousness can do, if not anything else. And that's sort of that same thing that you were talking before, that arrow pointing to this underlying substrate.
It's simple to talk about reality, to talk about the world, to attempt to offer a description of what's going on without implicitly assuming space and time. I've did the best I could in this latest.
At the very least, time. Yeah.
Yeah, I tried in part 2 of this new book. I tried to talk about how the world can be looked upon, can be seen without the assumption of space-time. It's the best I could do, but it's extraordinarily difficult to do that. I think we have a chance with the symbols of religious mythology.
Yeah, excellent. Chris, good to see you.
Hey guys, how are you?
We have 2 Chris's here. So
I don't want to drag you back, but I'm really interested in this idea that I'm trying to wrap my head around this idea of consciousness, right? So consciousness is a giant everything. Consciousness is the ether in which we all exist, or I'm not.
Every time. It's unavoidable in language to objectify consciousness by calling it an ether or a medium or the ground of something or an entity or a primitive. It's unavoidable in language. But despite it being unavoidable, every time we objectify consciousness, we are making a mistake. Consciousness is the subject. The only way for you to really have a fair view of consciousness is to go inwards. Is to look for that which is experiencing your experiences right now. It's not an entity out there. It's not a medium. It's not stuff.
Yeah, no,
it is the subject of your experiences. And as the subject, it's not huge. It's not large. It's not small. It's not in the past or in the future. It's where size exists. Within consciousness, the concepts, the ideas of size and time and objects arise. From that perspective, consciousness is all-encompassing without having size. It is the subject.
Right.
It's you.
It's almost like that which sits behind all possible experience and creates the relationships between those. So, when I describe it simply, I just refer to that because you can't really put a label on it, because putting labels linguistically is basically saying it's this and not this.
Exactly.
You're describing this in terms of what it's not versus. It's almost like trying to describe redness in terms of what it's not. You would say, well, redness is not blue, not green. You can go on almost infinitely. But to describe
it's not every wavelength that is red.
Right, exactly.
Right? We can say that. It's not every light wavelength that's red.
Right.
Well, I would say,
but at the same time, that premise still sits on the experience of what a shade is, principally. You know what I mean? Linguistically, I could talk about it, and I can throw nouns, and there's a syntax there. There's a relationship between the immediate experience of the sound waves and that come, that you experience. But if I'm saying that red and that sound is referring to something that is not the sound wave itself, where I'm representing it, you can't really get there without referring to that subject that experiences that redness directly, if that makes sense. So I simply just say consciousness is what is aware, basically, what knows, understands, and experiences. And I almost think it's predicateless in many ways.
But by this understanding, my consciousness is no different than your consciousness or Bernardo's consciousness or the tree in my backyard's consciousness or the gases that are in Saturn's atmosphere's consciousness. Am I following you right?
I'll go with you halfway. Your consciousness and my consciousness are exactly the same thing. It's not, even to say that it's the same suggests that there are two things that are identical. It's only one thing going on. Your sense of I am, that sense.
No, I get it, dude. I understand. Let me. I'm a long time meditator. I sit long meditation courses. I understand this concept of sitting down and looking inward for the I that knows the experience and not finding it. I'm with you right up until that point.
Okay. But then the second half of what you said is the gas in Saturn's moon consciousness. I would say the gas in Saturn's moon, an asteroid, the moon of the Earth, the color red, the color blue, these are different patterns of excitation of consciousness. Those patterns of excitation do have predicates, do have attributes, do have properties that can be differentiated from each other. One pattern of excitation is different from another. One choreography is different from another choreography. But it's
how are these excitations choreographed? Like, how do these excitations come about in consciousness?
The idealist ontology doesn't deny physics. To the extent that you're asking for what are the rules according to which these excitations unfold, I would just refer to physics to the extent that we understand physics. The laws of physics reflect the intrinsic archetypes of consciousness according to which consciousness's excitations unfold.
Repeating behaviors of consciousness in a universal sense would be what we would call a physical law, because we've established sort of a uniformity and a repeating. But fundamentally, on an ontological level, it would just be how consciousness is acting repeatedly within the scope of our space-time experience.
Correct. I mean, if we go back to the analogy of a medium that gets excited, the word medium is horrible because it objectifies consciousness, but language puts you in this kind of problems. Going back to the medium that gets excited, different patterns of excitation can interfere with one another according to very predictable regularities that you can predict in advance. You can see whether the interference will be constructive or destructive. You can calculate what the resulting interference pattern will look like. These are the laws of physics, our ability to model these regularities, the way these patterns interfere with one another. This is what our physics does. This is the abstraction we call cause and effect, causality, the way the excitations of consciousness interfere with one another and the patterns they generate by interfering. We even have tentative mathematical formulations for that.
Though. I've understood physics, and I'm not really educated or anything, but I've understood physics to be like the study of the way material interacts.
That already has an ontological load if you assume that material is something fundamentally outside and independent of consciousness. But if you call matter simply a stable modality of perceptual experience, then physics is just a way to model the unfolding of that modality of experience, the regularities of the unfolding of that modality of experience.
Right. So, no, go ahead and respond, Christopher.
I'm just having a hard time making any differentiation between what you're saying, and I heard Chris mention earlier when I first jumped in, he mentioned Nick Bostrom's the computer simulation. And I don't see much difference between what you're saying and that I just live in a computer simulation.
So I think a good way to...
Could I take this one, actually? Do you mind? Real quick. Yeah, there is actually a big difference there, because if you look at what Nick Bostrom says, he talks about there being a substrate, right? So he's basically a materialist. In other words, he thinks that all that exists is essentially matter or energy. That's all there really is. There's nothing but that, right? So this substrate and matter, energy, whatever you want to call it, he thinks, can simulate consciousness. So he says that, well, we're going to get to a level of computing power and so on, where eventually we're going to be able to simulate minds. You know how it goes, right? And eventually advanced civilizations are probably simulating us, right? The probability says that we're most likely simulations. The difference between what he's saying and what Bernardo here is saying is that Nick's a materialist. So he's saying that all experience is being simulated by this fundamental substance, matter. Whereas Bernardo is saying, he's still saying there's one fundamental substance. So there is a similarity. But the difference is he's saying it's not matter. It's consciousness itself. That's the fundamental substance. So there isn't anything being simulated, right?
So then what is consciousness?
So
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around this idea.
What he's saying is that also matter has a property whereby it can't really go beyond itself. It can't really, you can't appeal to matter alone and get experience, whereby you can appeal to consciousness and get both a subject and an object. So if you were to say that reality is only that which you can objectify, or that which is the external object from whatever vantage point of experience, outside of our experience in principle, not just outside of my immediate awareness, one would be saying that, okay, you have a problem in trying to account for experience at all, because experience involves so many different things, and one key thing is representation. So, for example, when you're driving on the road and you stop at a green light, there's nothing about the greenness of that light in itself, or any object for that matter, that inherently has the idea of go, or a red light that has inherently the idea of stop. That's meaning. That's something imposed externally onto matter. That's projected onto what Bernardo would call excitations in consciousness. Because we can't account for that in the object itself, there's what arises is things like the hard problem of consciousness, whereby you can't appeal to the brain states itself. You can't appeal to the process itself or behaviors in itself, because behaviors, emergent behaviors just come from just higher density or collective states of what you're appealing to more fundamentally. So there's no bridge basically to attributes of what we consider consciousness, namely awareness, that subjective, that crass experience, and the object itself. Bernardo starts from this way and says, we have experience of generating our dreams. We have experience of generating thoughts. We have experience of bringing those into the fore. Whereas we don't know that matter, and nor can we know that matter has the ability to bring experience into a relationship with itself, if that makes sense.
But if not through matter, how on earth would that happen? I mean, I don't...
Every theory of nature will have to adopt one thing that you cannot explain, which is just a given of nature, because explanations work by explaining one thing in terms of another, and that thing in terms of another, in terms of another, and you can't go on forever. At some point,
wouldn't it make sense to assume material? Like, we can assume material because, like, we're here and I'm like got my headphones on and I'm talking to you over a vast fiber optic network that. I feel like the assumption that material is a lot easier assumption to make than this idea of consciousness.
You're buying into a conflation that comes from the cultural narrative. You're appealing to an intuition, your intuition of solidity, concreteness, palpability. You're appealing to that intuition, and you're saying the intuition that this is solid, that this is persistent, this is in my hands, this is
I'd call
real.
it much more than an intuition.
Allow me to at least complete one attempt to answer your question, and we can iterate again. These are appealings to qualities of experience. Concreteness is a quality of experience that you feel. Solidity is a quality of experience that you feel. None of these implies a material world outside experience, because your intuition is associated to qualities of experience. What the materialist is telling you, and the cultural narrative doesn't really emphasize that, is that what you're holding in your hands right now, the headset whose pressure you feel around your ears, all of that is actually happening inside your skull. But when you look up and you see the stars at night, the stars you see are inside your skull, that your real skull is beyond the stars, that your real skull is beyond the room you have around you. Your real skull is behind the screen you have in front of you, and that everything you call your life is a theater, a copy, generated inside your real skull. And therefore, the feeling of concreteness, of solidity, of palpability that you have actually are kind of illusions generated inside your head. The real world, the world of pure abstraction, it has none of the qualities of experience. It only has mathematically expressed relationships. It's akin to a set of mathematical equations. It's the closest analogy you can make. It has none of the qualities of experience whatsoever. That is the real world of materialism. So when you appeal to the concreteness and the solidity of the matter around you, you're actually making a case for idealism, making a case for the primacy of the qualities of experience and not the abstraction of materialism.
I don't
Okay,
know.
that didn't make much sense.
Yeah, I don't
silence.
know. Like you know, I'm
So,
trying to wrap my head around it.
Sure,
And I just can't.
No, it's a good way to think about it perhaps might be that, or another way to express that would be, you have, let's just say, let's go back to that sort of water, that ocean of water that we would probably call consciousness, right? It's an analogy here because I'm sort of trying to relate it. You can create bubbles in that water, right? So you can create bubbles in that water that would create perhaps a space-time arena. And then within that bubble, you can have little droplets. Now, the little droplets can be separate from one another. They can be sort of what Bernardo called dissociate.
While you're doing this, I'll take a quick bio break.
Sure,
Continue,
no
and
problem.
I'll be right back.
Sure. So you can have sort of droplets in this water where the ontology or the quality of what that substrate is not gone. It's just being localized in certain ways. And localization just allows you to have finite separation to whereby you can call you, and myself, me. These localizations are constraints. So it's almost like an interface that we've now constrained ourselves to. So now we can only perceive the world through the constraints of our finite expression. So essentially what he's saying is the brain is a universal consciousness, and that's a localized expression of consciousness. And then from the vantage point of that brain outwards is how consciousness experiences the world. It's very consistent with contemporary physics, from things like the simulation hypothesis, as well as quantum physics and the role of the observer. But I think perhaps what might make it a little bit more clearer is Stubbs, sorry. I don't know if you want to clarify and make a distinction between realism, direct realism, and indirect realism, and then perhaps that might be helpful in sort of clarifying what the approach.
Yeah, it might. I mean, I think ultimately, the problem here, Chris, is that, I mean, Bernardo did say this earlier because I asked about this. I mean, ultimately, for him, consciousness is going to be something that's undefinable in the end. In other words, he gave an example, I don't know if you were here for it, of a guitar string, right? Where he says, if you pluck the guitar string, right, it's vibrating, right? So this is essentially the behavior of the guitar string. There ultimately is just the guitar string, but there is somewhat of a difference, of course, between the vibrations of it and the string itself, right? So kind of in going with that analogy, there's no way, because another way to say it is because you're a participant in it, right? There's no way ultimately to get an objective definition if ultimately everything is one thing, right? So forget about calling it consciousness for the moment. Let's just say everything is X. Whatever X is, you might think it's matter or energy. He says it's consciousness C, right? Whatever you think, right? Whatever this thing X is, if we are ultimately X, there's a problem of trying to get an objective viewpoint, right? You can't get outside of the thing that you are in order to define it objectively, right? You can't go and observe it, step back from it and say, here, I see, I'm able to see it. I'm able to analyze it on all sides. You can't do that. All you can do is try to make an abstraction. And he used that word many times. Okay, an abstraction means to take something, to isolate it in your mind, to take it out of the particular case in which it's found. Okay, and to analyze its general characteristics and then focus on that general thing apart from those particular its particular characteristics in which it's embedded. But you can't really do that. You see, you can only do that to an extent. So ultimately, the substance, consciousness, or whatever it is going to be unknowable. So that's why he says consciousness is that which experiences, because by experiences, he's talking about the behavior or the plucking of the guitar string in his analogy, right, of what's happening. So he's going to talk about physics and all of that. And he's going to say, well, that's ultimately all consciousness. You see, now the difference between that and, let's say, the physicalist / materialist, right, is that Bernardo won't be claiming that there's a view from nowhere. So Thomas Nagel has used this phrase, the view from nowhere, right? An objective, the third person, right? It's a way of using the word view, but at the same way, it's view from nowhere. It's oxymoronic because it's denying that there is such a view. It's truly objective, right? It's out there. There is no view. There is no consciousness, right? There's no observation. So, a world like that where things just are, right? That's like the materialist perspective. This is different from what he's saying. See, but in either case, whether you want to say that all that exists is some objective stuff, call it matter or energy, whether you want to say, no, it's consciousness, all of that is going to be undefinable ultimately. All you can really do is talk about the behaviors of it, the characteristics of it, you see? Because think of it like this. Imagine you have the stuff on the surface. This represents the characteristics or properties, the behaviors, etc., the accidents in Aristotle's terms. Then you have the essence of the stuff of it all, right? If you're trying to, if ultimately the characteristics are really just the phenomenon of the essence, right? You can't ultimately define the essence because the very thing you're using to define it is part of it. You get it? So if you're a participant in it, you can't get outside of it to define it. So and that's going to be a problem no matter what. So so ultimately, I mean, I think he's not going to be able to truly answer your question if you're looking for an exact objective definition, because none can be given if you think all that exists is one thing.
Right. You just have to be it, and you have to, and then once you understand what being it in relation to representing it is, then you can actually say, okay, I experience what it is. And then I can go into reflexive mode and say, aha, I can identify, at least put a label on what the experience was. Even though you don't have to define it in any other term.
Okay, cool. I'm with that because I've had all kinds of experiences. I can talk about experiences. What I am very hesitant to do in my adult life is to make any kind of concrete statements or what's the word I'm looking for? Like, it's dangerous for me to conclude anything about the vast nature of the universe based on the experience which I have in my this skull. I don't know about my real skull that you were talking about before. That was confusing to me, but I do understand this skull, and I have a fairly good understanding of my personal experience in this skull. And I identify with a lot of what you guys are saying up until a certain point where I don't anymore, where I think a lot of the questioning and the comments comes from, where when different people are given the same sets of circumstances and they come to different conclusions, then why is that? And that's really what I'm interested in too. Like, my experience tells me something very different than what I'm hearing you guys' experience tells you.
If I may comment, try to make one more comment on this. After that, maybe we could. There are some other interesting questions.
Yeah, I'll make it.
I'll
make it available.
But I think the point you raised now is good. Let me try one last attempt, one final attempt. The skull I was referring to is the skull of physicalists. It's the skull that is beyond the world you experience. And that is supposed to be your real skull, because all of your experiences, according to physicalism, are generated by your brain inside your real skull. And the skull you see in the mirror is not your real skull. It's a reproduction created by your brain of your real skull in a real outside world that you have no experiential access to. It's a world of pure abstraction. My position is different. In my position, your skull, your head, is in your mind, not your mind in your head. Your skull is an element of the entire range of your experiences. The range of your experiences characterizes your personal mind. Your skull, your body, as you see, as you feel it, is a subset of it. Obviously, this is very experientially verifiable. What you feel, the set of bodily perceptions that you have, is a very small subset of the broad range of your experiences. So my position is your body is an image of a localization of consciousness, and your body as such is part of your consciousness. Your body is in your consciousness, not your consciousness in your body. I'll maybe leave it at that. It's a complex subject. Okay. I don't think we are going to exhaust this.
Definitely. This could go on for ages. And thanks.
Thanks
for sharing.
Thank you so much.
I totally appreciate it. And this has been a totally interesting blab, and I'm going to make my seat open so someone else can have a crack at it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Can I take a question from Kathy Wampus?
Yes, go for it. Absolutely. In the slide. Do you mind reading the question?
Yeah. I was just browsing it and I thought this was interesting. And the question is, how is this consciousness not the same as God of the gaps? You're using that word just like substrate or God or energy to describe the unknown and use it as more, quote, parsimonious explanation of that we do not know yet. In this case, lowercase consciousness or mind. I understand the point here, but you see, every theory of nature, every ontology will always come to a primitive, to something that you cannot explain. Physicalism is no exception. Exactly what Kathy wrote here can be said of the quantum vacuum. It's the God of the gaps. It's a word we are using to describe the unknown, or the brains of a M theory. It's also the God of the gaps. It's a word to describe a fundamental unknown. The difference is the following. Physicalism adds a fundamental unknown. It adds a redundant step. Physicalism will say, there is God, quantum vacuum, brain, superstrings, whatever. There is that fundamental unknown, fundamentally unexplainable aspect of reality. From that, we derive matter. And from matter, somehow, we derive consciousness. Now, you have the first unknown, the physicalist primitive, and you have the second unknown, the hard problem of consciousness. So you end up with two things that you cannot make sense of. What I'm saying is we don't need the second bloody thing. Consciousness is already the primitive. It is the sole unknown. Everything else can be made sense of and explained in terms of the patterns of excitation of consciousness. So do I still have an unknown? Yes, but it's one unknown, not two. That's why my view, I think, is more parsimonious.
And the thing is this, I think there's a clear distinction to make here. When he says unknown, he does not mean this, there's some, well, what I want to say is, what he means is there's no way to represent it in such a way that you can get to the comprehensive nature of it.
Correct,
so
exactly.
The tendency among scientists and physicalists is that we know something when we can stand back from it and make a description of that. And in many ways, what we're doing is we're saying our description is identical to the thing in itself.
Correct.
There's an important distinction there. In philosophy, there's multiple types of knowledge. You have personal knowledge, knowledge by being acquainted immediately with a quality, and you have propositional knowledge. What we're saying is personal knowledge is more fundamental than propositional knowledge. If you use personal knowledge to identify the fact that there is experience and there is something that knows and that understands and experiences, you don't have a problem when it comes to representing it. The problem becomes is when you think that representation is more fundamental, because representation is regressive infinitely. You can always where does the representation start and where does it end? Because there's infinite amount of objects that might exist in between the subject and the final object. So it's important to understand that we are talking about something, even though it's inexplicable in a propositional sense. It is not something that is completely absent from our experience of the world.
Absolutely. Consciousness is the unknown in the sense that we cannot reduce it to something else. In other words, we cannot explain consciousness in terms of something else. We cannot delineate a propositional explanation for it. In that sense, it is unknown, and that's the sense indeed in which I meant it, Curtis. You're correct. In another sense, the sense of direct knowledge, consciousness is all we know. There is nothing we know except consciousness. All we know is consciousness, because what you do not experience in consciousness might as well not exist. You don't know about it.
Correct.
So that propositional unknown, that unknown in the sense that you can't reduce it, is all you know directly. Is your entire life. Is all of existence.
Hey, what's up, guys? Two questions with that. When you say consciousness and then Nomad said substrate, since we're just using those to describe the undescribable or indescribable, how does a layperson know who's talking about what?
This is a limitation of language. When we talk about patterns of excitation or vibration of consciousness, basically we are using metaphors. We are trying to appeal to something that is known, to give a cognitive link for people to make sense of what I'm saying. Therefore I use the term medium, because medium is something we know can be excited, can vibrate, can move in some way. But that's metaphorical, because the essence of what I'm saying is that consciousness is not an object. Consciousness is the subject. I'm talking about very subjective vibrations of the subject, creating the stream of experiences we call reality.
What other word other than consciousness could you use to describe that? Other than medium and other than consciousness?
That which experiences.
You could say what?
Every time you're looking for a noun, and every noun you find, we have the same problem. You can try it. Every noun you pick, this is built into language. This objectification is built into the language when we use nouns. You use a noun, you're already objectifying it. The alternative is to refer to it operationally or indirectly. And that's why I say that which experiences. Actually, I wrote a technical philosophical paper in which I do not use the word consciousness. I use that which experiences first time, and then I say TWE. In the rest of the paper, I only use TWE to avoid precisely this. But that's a technical philosophy paper that philosophers will understand. If I talk to people and say, well, TWE here, TWE there, that which experiences, people will not get it.
And I guess this is my problem with this entire thing, because I'm having a hard time understanding how this is not an exercise in futility. Since it could be God, I could replace that with God, I could replace that with substrate, I could replace that with energy, I could replace it what Aldous Huxley called the sacred not I could replace it with a million different things and give it all the attributes in the world that it needs to, in order to exact in our physical world.
I'm totally with you.
It gets us nowhere.
I completely sympathize with that.
The difference is both of you have been actively been against physicality and the virtues of physicality, which have gotten us medicine, technology has gotten us to the moon.
No, not at all. Not at all. This is completely fallacious. It is not physicalism that has given you medicine and engineering. It is the predictive models of science. Science is ontologically neutral. All these predictive models work as though things were this or that way, and they are predictively correct. You do not need to attach an ontology to that for these things to work. Physicalism didn't give us engineering. It was those predictive models that are ontologically neutral, interpretation neutral, that gave us technology. Physicalism is a way to interpret those models from the perspective of their beingness. That's all.
Go ahead.
Let me go back to one thing you said. I completely sympathize with this idea that we are just postponing the problem by giving words and postulating entities, God, consciousness, whatever word you want to give to this. I sympathize with it. And the attempt I'm trying to make here is precisely to avoid as much of that as possible. Because what physicalists will say is, okay, there is experience. Now I will infer matter outside experience whose excitations generate experience. And now I need to infer something behind matter as a primitive out of which matter arises. I will call that a quantum vacuum. So now I have two layers of inference, two layers of abstraction to explain the known, which is my direct experience. What I'm saying is, come on, let's eliminate at least one of these layers.
Essentially what you're saying is, for the simplicity of science, let's eliminate those inferments. I don't even know if that's the right word. And let's remove inferences, thank you. And let's remove those layers and then just give it variable x. So it's an imaginary number that we're using. So variable x, we don't need to figure this out. We have a variable x and we can move forward. That's essentially what you're saying.
Well, so I think one of the key points that he made is that nouns themselves are mnemonic markers for bundles of properties, right? The mere fact that we have so many different languages in the world is the fact that nouns aren't intrinsically tied to the properties that they represent. One word in one language can mean something completely different in another language. So all we're doing is we're tagging labels to properties, right?
I agree.
So let's say, for example, let's take away those tags. Let's move those tags out the way and look at the properties in themselves. What we're actually saying is that those properties are the nature of those properties are only revealed to our experience of those properties. There's no other ground in those properties themselves that's going to give us a qualitative understanding.
And I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that whatsoever. But you guys, I guess you're conflating the collection of all those properties as some entity that lives in and of itself outside of our experience. Versus
no, not at all, not at all. Precisely, that's the point at the beginning. There is nothing.
Our perception.
Those qualities are qualities of experience. They are ripples of water. There is nothing to the ripples but water. So precisely what I'm saying is that there is nothing to experience but that which experiences. It's the same ontological entity. It's the same thing. It's just that the behavior of that which experiences creates our ability to discern one thing from the other through patterns of excitation.
I would venture to say, and this is, I think, where a lot of the physicalists or materialists on this chat take umbrage, and somebody could correct me, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but what you guys are calling the water of consciousness only exists because a brain came up with a concept and put a scoop of water in there, and then another brain put a scoop of water in there, and then that water essentially got filled up to a point where now you're calling that this universal consciousness. I'm saying those concepts never existed before.
You're making the question extraordinarily. Look, your concept of a brain outside consciousness is something you invented in your consciousness. It's something that exists in your consciousness. You're buying this concept and you're taking this as a given, as an assumption that is obviously true.
Right, but okay, so we're at a stalemate because you're saying my brain invented that, and I'm going to say that your brain invented the fact that there's something outside of your brain.
I'm not saying that you're...
An interesting thing, I think, to make a key point on here is that Bernardo and I don't actually have identical positions. I think Bernardo is more of an idealist, and he refers to objects of consciousness as excitations of consciousness and in consciousness. What I say is that the objects of consciousness are still dependent on the activity of consciousness, but they are not consciousness in itself. So it's something that consciousness can stand back from and see itself distinct from. Though the implications of what we're saying are the same thing, namely that consciousness is a substrate that gives rise. It's almost like looking at an optical illusion, right? You can change your ability to see what's in the fore and what's in the background based on what you obfuscate. For example, if I have a square here and I cover, the sides, now I'm seeing a triangle. You know what I mean? This is not something inherent to the object itself. It's inherent to how you perceive the world. It's inherent to your vantage point. And all of those things are in themselves individual experiences. Your vantage point, the quality, you know what I mean?
I get that, Nomad. But the problem is you're making it seem or inferring that the funhouse mirror that you're looking at exists without you looking at that funhouse mirror. That's the problem that I have. You understand?
No.
The image that's in the funhouse mirror somehow existed prior to me looking at myself through the funhouse mirror. That's the problem.
No idea
that's what concepts, that's what you mean by properties, that's what you mean by things. You're saying all these things exist in the ethos outside of somebody perceiving them. And then that we bring them into existence through our perceptions, but they were already there prior to me perceiving them. That's the problem. Yeah, of course.
That's what physicalism entails.
Well, I think there's a little bit of a conflation.
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying you're saying you're rejecting that notion. You're rejecting that those things exist.
No. I'm not denying that there is a world outside your personal awareness, which is a dissociated outer of universal consciousness. I'm not denying that there is cognitive activity outside that which you identify yourself with. What I'm saying is that external cognitive activity is outside your outer, but it's not outside consciousness itself. It's cognitive activity unfolding in areas of consciousness outside your dissociated outer, but not in a material world independent and outside of consciousness.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I thought this whole blab, that's what you guys were saying. So thank you for clearing that up.
That's a point somebody also made in the live chat.
So you guys are saying that the mind is not independent of the brain.
Referring to the mind and brain is already an appeal to either dualism or physicalism. And the idea that the brain generates the mind is part of another ontology. So you shouldn't take that as a given, because that's exactly the point in contention. What I'm saying is that the brain does not generate the mind. The brain is the image of a process of dissociation in transpersonal mind. It's the image of the process.
So that's the problem that we hear. That's a stalemate, the chicken or the egg. You just said that the brain is the image of the mind. Versus most of us will say the mind is the image of the brain.
When I use the word consciousness and mind, I will mean it in a transpersonal way. So not limited to your personal awareness. It's like inferring that the Earth goes beyond the visible horizon. It is still the Earth. It's the same stuff. It's the same entity, but it goes beyond its face value limits. So when I say, give me a chance to try to explain this. So mind at a transpersonal level is all there is. Another word for it is transpersonal consciousness. I use these words interchangeably. Dissociation happens in this transpersonal mind, like it happens in the psyche of a person with dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder. And it has an image, like you can see the image of a dissociative process through a functional brain scanner in the brain of a person with dissociative identity disorder. The image of that dissociation that you consider yourself to be is what we call a body, a biological body, including the brain. So in my perspective, your body, including your brain, is the image of a dissociative process in transpersonal mind. And because you are that dissociative process, at least that's what you identify yourself with, you identify with the image of that process, which is your body. You identify with your own body. Now, this doesn't mean that the brain generates the mind. The image of a process is not the cause of the process. The whirlpool is the image of a process of localization in water, but the whirlpool is not the cause of it. It's the image of the process, not the cause of the process. So what I'm saying is that your brain activity correlates so well with your personal experience because it's the extrinsic image of your personal experience. It's what it looks like from the point of view of another dissociated outer, like myself looking at your brain activity through a brain scanner. It's not the cause, it's the image. And as the image, it correlates very well. All the ontological grounding is exactly the same in one, transpersonal mind. All we are seeing are the images of processes in transpersonal mind. The inanimate world are like ripples in the ocean of transpersonal mind. Living beings are like whirlpools in the ocean of transpersonal mind because they are localization, dissociative processes.
And it's just to clarify, like many religious traditions would even use the term image bearer, right? Where you share or participate in many ways with the ontological nature of what fundamental reality is. Mm-hmm. You are just a partition of those same properties in a localized way. In the same way that Carl Sagan would probably say, we're just star stuff. Obviously, he's just referring to the image and saying that we're just the image, we're image stuff in it, but we're just a localized expression of that.
No, I think he's a materialist, and he's saying we're star stuff, meaning we're made of atoms and molecules.
Oh, right. Yeah, but in relation to our position, we would just be saying that about mind. We would just be saying that, yeah, there's mind all out there, and in the same way that you're saying that matter's out there, except that our particular minds are just a localized expression of mind at large that has the ability to be in relationship to an image that expresses a process.
I see. I think
Correct.
I'm gonna step off here in a second. I just want one last clarification. The guitar analogy, I heard that a lot. So in that guitar analogy, which is the brain, which is the consciousness, or was that just to make the point that these things create sound and then sound is separate from the guitar? Is there an actual relation to those things?
I'll try to explain. When we bring in the brain into the picture, you're already talking about a dissociative process, and that analogy was prior to there being dissociation. It was something more fundamental. So what was the case prior to the origin of life? The origin of biology. That's what that analysis is referring to. What is the nature of the universe before life arose? Life, in my view, is the image of dissociation. But there was a universe before there was dissociation in mind, because there was still mind. There were other types of processes unfolding in mind before the first dissociative process, which arose in the form of the first biological living organism. So going back to that, so prior to life, prior to brains, prior to biology, what was the nature of things? And that's what the analogy explains. So think of it this way. Imagine that the only sense you have is hearing. You cannot see, you cannot smell, you cannot taste, you cannot touch. Mm-hmm. Can you try to imagine that in your direct experience? You can only hear. You've never known any of the other four senses. You were born without them. How's the name of that woman? Helen Keller.
Yeah. But instead
so an extreme.
She couldn't feel, she couldn't touch, she could just hear.
Yeah, but no, she couldn't hear and she couldn't see, she could only touch. So imagine an extreme version of that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can only hear. Now imagine that there is a guitar string that somebody plucks. You can hear the sound. Mm-hmm. And because all you can sense is to hear, your entire knowledge, your ability to know the guitar string is through hearing only, through the sounds it produces. There is nothing more you can know about the guitar string other than the sounds it produces, because you're restricted to hearing. You cannot touch the guitar string to feel its solidity, its length, its temperature. You cannot see it. You cannot sense its texture. You cannot smell it. You cannot put your tongue on it. There is nothing about the guitar string that you can know other than the sounds it produces. In other words, its excitations. The guitar string, without it being excited, is fundamentally beyond your knowledge. If the guitar string is not excited, you can fundamentally not know it. It's fundamentally beyond your ability to relate to it. All you can know is the sounds it produces, and then you can infer things about it based on the sound. If you have a model of nature that relates the frequency of the sound with the length of the string, you can infer that, but you cannot see the length of the string. You can only hear the sound. Keep this in mind now. What I'm saying is that there is only consciousness. It's the guitar string. But all you can know are experiences, which are the vibrations of consciousness. All of your experiences are the excitations of that which experiences of yourself.
Let me ask you a question. How did you, since consciousness in this case to you is the guitar string that's outside of perception, how can you, as a person, as a human, infer that the guitar exists in the first place?
If we are to have a linguistically...
Since you have limited senses, you yourself can only hear, according to your analogy. So remember, how are you inferring that there's a guitar out there, since you could only hear sound?
A guitar string, right?
Or a guitar string, or the plucking. Well, I mean, it's the plucking of the guitar strings, the sound bouncing in the sound hole and the resonance.
So let's go back to the analysis.
I'm asking you a personal question. How are you able to make the leap and say there's a guitar? Since you could only hear sound. So what makes you more special?
I'm attempting to answer the question. The answer is already embedded in the analogy we just discussed. Remember that it was part of the analogy that you can infer things about the guitar string, even though you can only hear it. If you have a model of reality that allows you to infer the length based on the frequency of the sound you hear, That's an inferential knowledge that you can have. Now, the most basic inference that you can make, that you can absolutely make based on hearing the sounds, is that there is a guitar string, whatever it is. Because if there is something creating those sounds, there is a guitar string. The only inference I'm making, it's the sole inference I'm making, is that there is that which experiences, because there is experience. In the context of the analogy, I can hear the sound, so there is a guitar string. I'm not inferring anything more about it. I'm not saying what it is, how long it is, how thick it is, or what it looks like. I'm not attributing any other property to it other than its ability to produce sound. If I hear a sound, I can very safely infer that something creates that sound. In the case of experience, it has to be the subject which experiences. If I experience, if there is experience, there is surely that which experiences. And short name for that is consciousness.
I'll step off, and thank you for taking your time to speak. I'm going to step off and let someone smarter than myself come on, which is everybody on here. But just to answer that real quick, I guess my problem is that you coming up with these theories is equivalent to you assuming that it was a guitar string in the first place, because you have no way of knowing that the sound actually came from a speaker, which had a synthesized sound of a guitar string, and it was created by a computer, and it was never actually done by a guitar.
Let's talk about that before you leave.
You have no way of knowing that it was a synthesizer.
I am not saying that it is not a synthesizer. I'm not saying that it's a guitar string. That's what the metaphor breaks. I'm only saying that something is there to produce the sound. In other words, I'm only saying that there is that which experiences. I'm attributing nothing else to it. In the analogy, it may be a synthesizer. It may be a banjo. For all I know, it may be a bass instrument. I don't know. I don't know what it is. I only know that whatever it is there because I can hear the sound.
Right. He's affirming, basically he's affirming that there is something experiences. There's not just the object of experience, because if you deny your own experience, you have to justify your denial in terms of your own experience. If you reject,
I understand.
You know what I mean?
I understand. My point is that it's not very accurate, because we've already went from a guitar string to now it's a sound that I experienced. But the last scenario is you guys didn't know that nanobots were inside your brain. Since you can't feel, remember, you have no sense of touch. Nanobots came inside your brain and actually shook the bones inside your ears that regulate sound and transmits it into electricity into your brain. So they actually physically moved, and there was no sound. They just knew exactly how to do it, so your brain would perceive it as sound. So there was actually no sound, no guitar, no synthesizer, none at all. It was actually little robots inside your ear that made that sound.
There's a lot there. Yeah, nanobots in a materialist framework, you're assuming a lot.
Saying that it's a guitar.
We're not even going
what I mean by consciousness, substrate and all that. You guys have no way of actually knowing that it's
Of course not. The essence of you're correct. The essence of the argument is parsimony. How many things do we need to postulate in order to come to a realistic, viable explanation for the experiences we call reality, for these consensus experiences we call reality? What I'm doing is I'm trying to postulate the minimum possible. Nanobots moving my ear bones in a physicalist framework, it's like a nested, simulated universe. It's like a flying spaghetti monster. You're postulating all kinds of things that you have no reason.
Right. So we're humans, since we only have that one sense, right? Let's say we're all Helen Keller. What we do is very, very crudely is all get together and somehow figure out a way to communicate. So maybe we were communicating with sound, with Morse code or something, and we figure out how to do that. And we're saying, hey, do you hear this guitar sound? And then with Morse code, we're telling each other, do you hear that? And they don't hear it. So finally, when you realize nobody hears it, then you realize it's just in your ear. But when other people hear it, you could triangulate that there's something there. And then you could get closer to it and say, hey, there's the guitar string. And it gets louder, it gets something. So now you could get a better picture. Well, and that's what we do as humans, and that's physical.
Yeah.
No. The argument of what you're saying is that there is the argument. All you can be certain based on the argument you said is not certain. All you can correctly infer from the argument you said, from the argument that there is a shared world we can now experience from different points of view, is that there is something outside your personal. Of course, I agree that collective consciousness exists, but it didn't exist before humans. That the fact that there exists something beyond your personal stream of experiences does not imply that that something is outside consciousness itself, that it's fundamentally of a different ontological nature than mind itself. That implication isn't there. So I acknowledge that there is something that we collectively experience, something outside our personal awareness. But outside personal awareness does not imply outside universal awareness or outside consciousness. That's the whole point of the argument about dissociation. You see, physicalism requires an ontological inference, while what I'm saying only requires that you infer that the Earth continues beyond the horizon. But it's still the Earth.
I'll leave you with that. I mean, all I'm saying is that I don't think that's the most accurate method. So I rather stick with the inferences, the physical inferences, because I could start getting a better picture. Even if it's totally inaccurate, at least it's more viable picture for all those humans that only have that one sense, versus making the leap and saying, hey, let's just assume that it's a guitar. Let's assume that the guitar is out there, you know, and then we'll leave it at that, since that's only one step.
I think no, thank you, Kelly. We'll let someone else jump on also. But just to respond to that quickly, the problem with trying to reduce Bernardo's position to just he's assuming that there's a guitar string out there, that analogy assumes that there is something separate from what he's referring to, separate from the experience that he's referring to. He's not even going that far. So we're sort of doing this Cartesian reduction down to what is the most primitive assumption we can make about anything of our experience, about the nature of inference itself, about the nature of logic, about the nature of anything that could be considered an experience, which is pretty much everything in our awareness, including the relationships and the behaviors. Those are all experiences in our awareness. And does it make sense for us to say that those things, those particulars, are still experiences, are still things outside of awareness in principle, not just our localized expression of awareness, but awareness in principle? I think that's what Bernardo is trying to get across, that there's no reason to do that. As soon as you postulate a reason to do that, you are taking yourself out beyond that fundamental assumption which we established as being probably most parsimonious.
It's the difference between inferring an extrapolation of the boundaries of a known ontological class and postulating a whole new ontological class to which we have no direct access.
Right.
Sorry, guys. I had to phase out there. I wasn't part of the discussion for a while while you were talking to that guy Caddy, because I had to take a call. I just kind of heard the tail end of that. I mean, I think part of there's somewhat of a disconnect here in some of these discussions. I mean, where, you know, I don't quite think that, you know, those that side with the materialist explanation understand the kind of motivating factors. And by motivating here, let me be clear, I'm talking about logically motivating factors, not as in emotional motivations, but logically motivating factors that lead one to look for alternatives for materialism as an explanation for our basic experience. So like the hard problem, probably is the main one, I think, in my view. And I, Curtis, I know yours too, and I think Bernardo as well, that if you just say, look, all that exists is matter, and if we say, all right, well, let's just take the view that there's these little particles or strings or whatever the fundamental units are, right? If all that exists is this stuff, and this stuff has no experience whatsoever. So if we ask the question, well, what would it be like to, let's say, be a proton or something like that? And the answer is, well, it would be like you were never born. You know, it would be like you had never been born. It would be like what it's like to be under anesthesia, which is, you know, it's not like anything, right? So that's what it's like then to be a rock, right? So if that's what we're talking about, so then why would some intricate arrangement of particles be the same as the experience that we're having right now? What exactly is identical about those two things, right? About the two things that we're referring to here. So we're making reference to our experience. I'm making reference to this description of particle, or describing this this hypothetically postulated, right, arrangement of particles, because after all, we experience that, right, as an abstract conception, right? But even the materialist has to admit we don't actually perceive that, right? I mean, on materialism, the general view is that the reality of your experience is a simulation, essentially. The brain is simulating the world. In other words, the technical term in philosophy is indirect realism. In other words, the world that you perceive is not directly the real thing. It's only indirectly perceived. So the white wall that I see with the white paint, the whiteness of the wall, is not the real wall. The real wall is a bunch of particles, and they have no color.
Right, and our brain reconstructs.
Right, they may be releasing photons at different wavelengths, but those wavelengths aren't the same. Those wavelengths aren't literally white on that view, right? That's the material. Yeah. So the world is colorless. The world is devoid of all qualities that we would perceive. In other words, it's real on that view, but it's only indirectly perceived versus direct perception.
I think, can we freely comment?
Yes, yeah, I'd go for it. Anybody else that wants to jump in and ask a question, I'd say we can do another like 15 minutes if you're okay with that. And then if you want to convene after that, just let me know. I don't want to hold you up.
Maybe we can end at the bottom of the hour.
Sure.
One argument that physicalists often use is the idea of emergence, that, okay, one neuron is not conscious. It doesn't produce any of the qualities of experience. 2 also don't. 10,000 also not. But at some point, for some reason, when you put enough neurons connected in some special way, then consciousness emerges. Now, this is an appeal to magic. In all known established forms of emergence, we can deduce the qualities of the emergent property from the components of the system, the basic components of the system. For instance, I can deduce the shapes of sand dunes from the known parameters of wind and sand grains. I can run it through a computer simulation, and I can simulate the shape of sand dunes on my computer. So I can deduce the properties of I can deduce the emergent property, the characteristics of the emergent property from the characteristics of the basic components of the system. That's true emergence. But in the case of strong emergence, in other words, the consciousness simply popping out when enough complexity is there in a nervous system, you cannot, even in principle, deduce what it feels like to see red, what it feels like to be in love, what it feels like to feel hunger from the mass, charge, momentum of the subatomic particles composing your brain. You cannot make that deduction even in principle, unlike all other forms of true emergence in which you can make that deduction. So appealing to emergence to explain consciousness under a physicalist framework is either an appeal to magic or the labeling of a fundamental unknown. We are taking something that we don't know, we don't understand, we don't know how it works, and we're giving it a name, and we get this warm, fuzzy feeling that we explained it. And that's exactly what Ray Kurzweil does in his 2005 book, The Singularity is Near. He's basically appealing to an unknown. He thinks that if you put enough complexity, somehow, for some reason, this thing will just pop into existence. You're not making any advancement in our understanding here. We are just appealing to magic or labeling a fundamental unknown.
Yeah, and one of the problems is that it's predictive ability. Where's the threshold that actually brings about consciousness? At what degree? How do we test it? You know what I mean? We have things like paramecium that seem to exhibit learning types of behaviors. You know what I mean? They're not as complex as a human brain, but they learn. In many ways,
absolutely,
they have types of experiences. You know what I mean?
I think we
say that a brain at a certain level of complexity produces consciousness. You know, at what level of complexity does this thing pop out? And that's one thing.
And we can't even really we can't measure that directly. We can only know that through the reporting of the subject itself. And even there, we are fundamentally limited, as we talked about before. The subject will only report the areas of consciousness of which he is self-reflexively aware. In other words, the things that not only he experiences, but he knows that he experiences. Because we have a bunch of experiences that we are experiencing right now, and we don't know about that. For instance, until I say this, until this very moment, you are experiencing your breath, the air going in and out of your lungs, caressing your nostrils, but you didn't know that you were experiencing it until I said it. The moment I said it, it jumps into your self-reflective awareness, and you know that you are experiencing it. 1 minute ago, were you unconscious of your breathing? Was it completely outside of your experience? Or you simply weren't aware that you were experiencing it? So even the best methods for studying consciousness scientifically will be restricted to our ability to report internal states, and that ability is fundamentally limited to self-reflective awareness, which is a small subset of experience.
Right. Welcome, Anthony. How's it going?
How's it going, you guys? I'm doing well. It's always a pleasure. I've certainly enjoyed the talk thus far. Kastrup, I've been following you for a couple of years now. In some ways, you can say I am a fan, although I don't necessarily know if it would be for the right reasons. I heard about you through Steven Novella and the conversation that you guys kind of had with him, and I found that conversation fascinating. And there were a couple of things from kind of reading your responses to Novella that still seemed a little bit unclear, that I kind of wanted to explore a little bit. And also, I was personally interested in kind of the epistemology with regards to kind of how you came to your position to begin with. But as Christopher kind of so eloquently put it a couple minutes ago, rather than sticking to the epistemology, or at least certain aspects of epistemology, rather focused on apologetics, which I'm perfectly fine entertaining. So we can certainly, like I said, go down this route if you want. And I guess the main thing would be, from what Novella's position was he was talking about basically the brain states and mental, or maybe to rephrase, mental states can be entirely explained, more or less, by brain states through a materialist paradigm. And my first question for clarification is, what first issue do you kind of take with that?
It can't be explained because you cannot deduce the qualities of experience from the parameters of physical arrangements. All you can find is a very tight correlation between the two, but correlation is not causation.
Okay, but and that's maybe where I'm struggling to understand, is it almost seems implicit in the argument that you're making, is it seems that you're saying that science in some way can explain everything. Science can explain these phenomenological experiences. And what worries me is, you're familiar with, I can't, the lady that gets set up in the gray room. I can't think of her name off the top
Mary,
of my
the
head.
color scientist?
Oh, okay, Mary, the colorblind scientist.
Yeah, you're familiar with Mary. And philosophical ideas like this are used in certain contexts with regards to the philosophy of science to kind of show that there are limitations to our scientific understanding. And we can explain the hows and the whys of all these different things, but there are certain limitations, so to speak, with regards to science. And it seems in some ways, and I don't necessarily want to use the word arrogant, but it seems most appropriate to say that we can have these scientific understandings about everything, including what it's like to be a bat, as it has been talked about in the philosophy of mind.
Yeah, I think what you see happening today a lot is a conflation between science and philosophy. Many scientists perform this conflation without being aware of it, without knowing that they are doing exactly this. They assume materialism as an ontology, and they conflate that with science. What science can hypothetically do, and I acknowledge it, is to find a very precise correlational mapping between brain states and subjective experience of an individual in such a way that by measuring brain states, we can make very good inferences about what the experiences of the individual are. This does not explain the nature of being either of the experience or the individual. It's the predictive tool. That's what science makes. Science makes predictions. Those predictions can work regardless of ontology, regardless of the interpretation of the predictions. To give you an example, in this case, suppose I have a full correlational mapping between brain states and a subject's experience, and I can measure the individual's entire brain, measure its states, and make good inferences about what the experience of the individual is. Two ways to interpret that. One, the brain generates experience somehow, but that leaves an enormous explanatory gap. Two, brain activity is the image of the subject's experience. It's like a different camera angle on the same phenomenon.
To interject,
so if I have one
to interject real quick, I do, and as Novella made this distinction as well, there's a difference between understanding how the brain creates consciousness and if the brain creates consciousness. And his case is that there is overwhelming evidence to support the brain being the cause of consciousness, as creating consciousness. And whether or not we don't necessarily know how it does that is irrelevant, because we can come to learn these things as we've seen with genetics and with other different things, where we don't necessarily need to know all the hows to understand that there's a fundamental if or cause. And so
let's go to that.
Yeah,
I don't see how that follows. I mean, I think that in order to understand that, you do need to understand how, because if you don't know how, like if go ahead, Bernardo. Sorry.
Novella's argument is that look, if I shoot you in the head, I will end your consciousness. I don't know how the brain produces consciousness, but if I damage your brain, your consciousness will end. So even though I don't know how it does it, I know that it does it because physical interference with somebody's brain will effectively change the experiences of this person.
And just to clarify his position a little bit, he basically makes the case that there is no limit really to our ability to change the subjective experience when we interfere with the brain. We can literally, as he kind of lists, sexual identity, moral decision-making, personality, the ability to even think about the world, all of these different things we can do simply by basically poking at your brain.
So for the sake of argument, let's grant him even that. Let's grant him that if we knew exactly how to perform the right type of physical interference with somebody's brain, we could create in that person any experience we wanted. Let's even grant that.
Okay.
Is that reason to believe that the brain creates experience? No. And let me tell you why.
Please.
Novella's argument stems from a quote, unconscious, implicit assumption of a form of dualism. Built into the argument is the idea that consciousness is one thing and the material brain is another, and that the former is generated by the latter. So there is a form of dualism implicit in this argument. To really make it clear to you, let me tell you my interpretation of this. I acknowledge everything that we said, that we attributed to Novella right now, that physical interference with the brain changes experience in any way we want. Let's grant that. Under my ontology, what is the brain? The brain is the image of a process in consciousness. It's not a material entity outside consciousness. There is no dualism implied in what I'm saying.
I'm not sure how he holds dualism. Sorry.
Just bear with me. So I have one complete story.
Okay.
Let me repeat this because I want this to be in a sequence.
Please.
Under my ontology, the brain is the image of a process in consciousness. There is nothing to the brain but consciousness, in the same way that there is nothing to a whirlpool but water. You can delineate the boundaries of a whirlpool. You can point at it and say, there is a whirlpool. It looks like this and that. It changes over time. It has certain attributes. Yet there is nothing to it but water. The same for the brain. You can point at it. You can delineate its boundaries. You can make attributions to it. You can describe it. Yet, in my view, there is nothing to the brain but consciousness. It's the image of a process in consciousness. Point one. Point two. What is physical interference with the brain in my ontology? It's the image of another process in consciousness. It's like a major ripple going from the stream, entering and disrupting the whirlpool. There is nothing to physical interference but a cognitive process in consciousness. Therefore, that physical interference with the brain changes subjective experience is no more surprising than the fact that your thoughts change your emotions, or that your emotions change your thoughts. One process in consciousness can causally interfere with another process in consciousness, fully, in a very deep way. Nothing in what I'm proposing precludes that. So if you can mentally get rid of this hidden assumption of dualism, which is what Novella has in the back of his mind, you will see that none of what he says contradicts what I'm saying. Physical interference with the brain is the image of a process in consciousness, like thoughts, which interfere with another process in consciousness, like emotions, except that this other process in consciousness is the inner life of a dissociated alter, of consciousness. If you get rid of dualism, this whole thing becomes very clear. So again, Novella is wrong. He's begging the question. He's making dualist assumptions and destroying a straw man, not my argument.
And just to please clarify, in what way is he implied or unconscious dualist? Because if I remember Novella correctly, he says that the mind is the brain.
Okay.
Quite explicitly.
Either he says that the brain generates consciousness, or he says that the brain constitutes consciousness. The latter is the position of people like Daniel Dennett and Michael Graziano. They deny that consciousness exists.
Right,
they say
it's eliminative.
Yeah.
Eliminative materialism is a technical name for that position.
Yeah.
In that case, there is no point to the argument he made, because consciousness doesn't exist to begin with. There is only brain activity. And of course, if you interfere with the brain, you can change its brain activity. It's a trivial point. It's a red herring. There is no meaning in what he said, because it's entirely trivial. If I stick my hand in your brain, I would change the patterns of its activity. Duh, consciousness doesn't exist. There is no point. Now, he made the point. So he thinks it's not trivial. He's attributing implicitly and clearly some meaning to it. That meaning can only come if he's not denying consciousness, that if he's saying instead that the brain generates consciousness as something somehow separate and in some way distinct from the brain. That's the dualist assumption I'm talking about. In my view, there is no such distinction. There is only consciousness. The brain is part of consciousness. The brain is in consciousness. Physical interference with the brain is also in consciousness. Two processes in consciousness are like ripples and whirlpools. Ripples interfere with whirlpools. They can disrupt whirlpools. They can even extinguish a whirlpool. If a strong enough series of ripples comes in waves, comes into a whirlpool, it will disrupt and dissolve it. In other words, if I shoot you in the head, I will cause you to die. That's all there is to it. All can be made sense of with only one ontological class. Novella's beating chess with this argument displays philosophical ignorance, quite frankly. Apologies to him for putting it so plainly. But all kinds of hidden assumptions that people make without being aware of what they are actually assuming, the questions they're actually begging when they put forward this kind of argument.
How can you just clarify that a little bit more? Because it seems to be the case that what he's saying is, with his background in neurology, that the ideas of consciousness are hierarchical in their thinking, to where you have, as he's talked about with regards to David Chalmers and the hard problem of consciousness, he says he's kind of stuck between two positions. One obviously being the idea that there is no hard problem of consciousness, just smaller individual problems, that once we start tackling these individual problems one at a time, we're going to have a little bit more of an understanding until there's no other problems to tackle. And then
I think
that's an appeal to magic. It's an appeal to magic. Yeah. It's the strong emergency argument.
Right. I think that's Dennett. I think Chalmers is a pan.
How is that?
Correct.
How is that an appeal to magic?
Let's say that you have one light switch on your wall, and you flip it on and off. There's a change of state. There's information there because there's a change of state, information being defined as a discernible change in state, in space or in time. You might say there's no consciousness there. It's just a light switch. Now imagine that there are 10 interconnected light switches. Mm-hmm. It's still just light switches interconnected. If you make 100 instead of 10, did it change anything fundamental about the capabilities and properties of the system?
Hello, you
have 100 light switches. Instead, Chris, could you mute your...
Hello, Financial Chris speaking.
Chris, could you mute? There we go. Going from 10 to 100 switches adds nothing new to the system. It only adds complexity, but no new property, no new capability, no new potentiality. Going from 100 to 10,000 is the same. Now, what these people do is they appeal to our inability to imagine extraordinarily large numbers. And they hide the appeal to magic in that inability to imagine extraordinarily large numbers. So they say, okay, from 10 to 100, nothing changes. From 100 to 10,000, nothing changes. But from 10,000 to trillion. Look at
See,
it.
but
It's such a huge
that is-
number of light switches.
That is a mistaken understanding of neurology right there, because that implicit in that is a binary understanding of consciousness, where consciousness is a gradient. Consciousness doesn't just come about when all of a sudden there's enough neurons. Consciousness exists in way smaller forms when there's 10 light switches, and then when there's 20 light switches, you have a second order level of consciousness, and 100 light switches and a billion light. So that demonstrates a fundamental ignorance of the
Then you're
No,
a
well,
psychic.
well, are you saying that consciousness is intrinsic, has nothing to do with complexity, that it's not emergent? Is that what you're saying?
Consciousness exists throughout. Consciousness is these chemical reactions, and consciousness exists in smaller, less sophisticated organisms as it does all the way up.
Let's go in the opposite
To
direction.
say that a pig is less conscious because it lacks certain intentional states is absurd.
Curtis, can I give it a try?
Go ahead.
Give it a try on that, because I find it very interesting. So, what was your name again?
Call me AJ or the dude, whatever works.
AJ, the dude. AJ, is an atom conscious?
Is an atom conscious?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I don't think so, based on my understanding of what would constitute something that would be conscious.
Okay. Is one neuron conscious?
Not one neuron.
Not one neuron.
Oh, I mean, actually, not to my knowledge. I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist.
So, at what level?
I'm not going to speak out.
At what level do you think consciousness arises? At what small level?
I don't know.
Could you say 100 neurons? Okay, 312, the number of neurons in a flatworm. Is it okay? 312 neurons. A flatworm is conscious.
There's a degree of consciousness, I think, that can be said.
Oh, no.
It's a gradient.
No.
It's not binary.
Unless an electron is conscious, you have to tell me the point in which consciousness flips into existence.
That's absurd.
We can only talk about...
That's the same type of argument that creationists use with regards to evolution.
No.
If we see the exact moment where we turn into a human, that is absurd, Kastrup.
AJ, if you tell me that an atom is unconscious and 10 neurons are conscious, there is a fundamental switch between one atom and 10 neurons. I don't know where that switch happens, but somewhere there, a switch has to happen. Digital, from no consciousness to a little bit of tiny proto-consciousness.
That's
the fundamental idea of with regards. I mean, if you want to look at something like abiogenesis, you can look at this as in some way a conscious organism.
Now, totally different. Abiogenesis is a totally different question.
Well, when you have anonymity to something that is now animated.
Either you tell me that consciousness permeates all nature at all levels, and that by aggregation of material, you increase the complexity of consciousness, and then you have shades of gray, then you have a gradual approach.
With regards to self-replicating organisms.
That's panpsychism. That's still panpsychism. Otherwise, you have to tell me what is it about life or self-replicating organisms that flips the switch from no consciousness at all to a little bit of consciousness. And there you find the hard problem again.
But
either you are a panpsychist or you have to face the hard problem.
But I mean, this is, like I said, when it comes to the philosophy of mind, there is no all of a sudden something's conscious. And if you hold that position to be true,
no. I think this is.
I don't hold
what he was saying is what he was trying to lay out is the implications of what you're suggesting. So what you were suggesting, based on perhaps what Novella was
Dennett.
Or Dennett. Well, I mean, Dennett is an eliminativist, so he was saying that.
I'm saying Dennett.
There is no.
And if you want, you can link the video in which he says specifically kind of what I'm referring to.
No, but what he's saying is this. What he's saying is this. Okay, if consciousness is an emergent property of individual discrete elements of reality, once they conjugate in a particular way, then you have two possibilities. You have one, consciousness always exists in the very, very small, minute, gradiented way where it's not completely zero. And then upon conjugation, you get more complex expressions of it. Or what I think you were putting forward was there is a point where there is zero consciousness. So what you were saying is there is no point where there is. No. So let me understand it properly now.
Yeah, go ahead, please. I said exactly
So you're essentially saying that there is no point in any object in the universe where there is zero consciousness.
I am saying specifically what you said with the former, where you have varying levels of complexity that constitute consciousness. Consciousness is not what would be the most ultimate form of this complexity. There are lesser complex neurological patterns that are set up that are constituted as conscious. And you can bring that down very, very far.
We should be clear in the terminology. If you're defining consciousness as a certain level of complexity of experience, that's not the way I'm using the word consciousness. So let me be clear.
Go ahead.
If you say that there is something it is like to be a fundamental subatomic particle, and that by aggregating this some things it's like to be a fundamental particle together in a higher and higher number of particles, that's how you get to human type consciousness or complex consciousness, then you are a panpsychist.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Which is not idealism. I'm not a panpsychist.
No one's saying that.
I think there's a fundamental mistake in panpsychism.
Yeah, no one's saying that.
But if that's not your position, then you are faced with a point somewhere where there is a fundamental transition from there is nothing it's like to be this to suddenly there is something it's like to be that. Even if it's very simple. If it's only the consciousness of black and white, or 1 or 0. But there is something it's like to be this at this level, and at that other level, there is nothing it's like to be that. Now you have to explain how the emergence of the something it's like to be happens by the arrangement of material particles that are, ex hypothesis, unconscious. Okay. And that is the hard problem again, at whatever level you put it.
How is that a hard problem? How is that not just because you have... when you have these particular things firing in this way and these things firing this way, you have an illusion of this self. You have an illusion of this awareness, of this experience.
Can I jump in here? Because there's no need to use the term awareness if the referent of that term describes things that we can refer to in our experience. In other words, like they always point to qualia, like what it feels like, sound, how it actually sounds.
What it's like to be a bat.
What it's like to be a bat, right? Nagel's famous paper. Exactly. So, but there's no reason to describe any of that at all when you're talking about particles. Nowhere in the terminology,
there is no reason to talk about it at all. Period. Right. We need to talk about how and why. We don't need to get when it comes to.
No. I think he was trying to make a point. I think you're changing the subject slightly.
Yeah.
He's trying to make a point. In other words, assuming your position. He's assuming the materialist position and then trying to expand on that. But go ahead, Chris. I want him to finish.
Right. It's a reductio. In other words, there's no reason to talk about conscious experience at all if the terminology you are using is one of a physical language. In other words, another way to put the hard problem, I like to put it this way, is to say that the two is that if you were to take like a phenomenological vocabulary, so you would take a vocabulary that you gain from the first person. So you're talking about the first person from the first person, right? In general terms, that's basically what phenomenology does. Okay, so you're talking about things in experiential terms, right? Now, that vocabulary I'm saying is totally incommensurate with the vocabulary of physical descriptions. So describing a physical reality. Remember the view from nowhere, that's another term Nagel uses, right? There would be no reason to get into things like qualia, intentionality, all of these things associated with subjective experience. There's no reason to talk about that. You can talk about the structure of the brain, which is essentially an arrangement of particles. You can talk about this particle was spinning in this way and had this positive and negative charge, and you can talk about that till you're blue in the face. At no point in talking about those aggregations of particles, right, are you talking about what it's like to be a bat, what it's like to be a human, the redness of a rose, blah, 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 right? There's
really no even predictive basis for going from one to the other. Like,
guys, I have to leave.
Yeah.
Why don't you guys go ahead, continue?
Sure.
I do have to leave. AJ, good questions.
It's always fascinating.
We would need more time to explore all this.
It's fascinating listening to how your brain works, man. Like I said, I'm more interested in kind of the epistemological roots on kind of how you've come to where you've come. I'm specifically interested in, as kind of was talking about in chat and Chris mentioned earlier, a lot of the different kind of emotional and psychological benefits that you feel that you kind of gain from this. And I'm interested because, as I was kind of making it clear to Chris, there are a lot of people that have heard everything that you've had to say. They've seen the data, they've listened to the reasons, they have done everything identical, and they don't hold your position. So what is the difference between you and them? And one variable And one variable with that is obviously emotional or psychological. I'm not saying that that is the sole reason or the only reason. But it's clearly a reason. It's clearly a variable.
You know what I think? So, honestly, I think, I mean, because I have a bunch of friends in, intellectual forums who are materialists, and I've gotten into this discussion a lot. I mean, I think, and this is in all fairness, I'm not trying to label anybody or attribute any motives. Like I told you, I'm kind of against that. That I don't like to get into that. Not saying that stuff doesn't operate, but I'm not interested in that. So what I honestly think is that I think that they tend to be. I tend to think of that people that are materialists tend to be very persuaded by the extreme level of correlation, because I noticed that when in these discussions, when we can get past like, okay, you have a position different from mine, and this is like, possibly a combative argument. Once we can get past that crap and just have an honest dialogue, it comes down to usually, well, in a simplified form, look, man, if you, put something to my head and, electrode to my head, you change who I am fundamentally as a person. You put ultrasound or something, or an electromagnetic, resonance machine, and you knock out, some part of my temporal lobe or something, this totally changes me, right? And for that, they're like, well, it has to be the case then that the consciousness we're experiencing is a material phenomenon somehow. And but I noticed that that what appears to be the case anyway, in their thinking, the assumption that they make is that we're living in a material universe to begin with. In other words, the ontology, what they think exists, is a bunch of matter, and they think that just is something in their mind that they don't really question for whatever reason.
Guys,
Kastrup,
one pause just for me to jump out. Curtis, it sounds like we're going to have to do this again.
Oh, yeah.
Because we haven't exhausted.
Link your stuff.
I didn't start recording from the beginning. Could you send me the video?
Oh,
I'd
yeah,
like
absolutely.
to have the video of this.
Plug.
This was the best interview I've ever participated in. Let me put it out there. The quality of you two and the quality of the people asking questions, top notch, the best I've had. I'll surely do this again if you invited me.
Plug your website.
Can you send me the video?
Plug your website.
Can you send me the video?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'll do that. Thank you so much for your time, Bernardo.
Plug your stuff so everyone can find you.
Thanks.
Yeah,
BernardoKastrup.com. My name, Bernardo Kastrup with a K.com.
Excellent. And then hopefully you can join us next month for Donald Hoffman. So we'll be interviewing him next month. And, if you want to jump on and do some dialogue there, that would be great too.
Sure.
But thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. What I'll do is
guys.
I'll stop the recording, and then I'll end this blab. And if you guys want to kind of continue the discussion, I'll restart another one, and then we can sort of discuss some of the details in this one. That way we can have this one reset.
You send me the video, right?
Yes, I'll do that for sure.
All right. Hey guys, thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Take care.
Bernardo.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, so just to finish that thought there, I mean, what I've noticed is that one thing that often goes unquestioned is, right, this is the same reason why, I often bring up the arguments of the hard problem. And one thing I see repeatedly, both directed towards myself by people who hold the materialist line of thinking, and I see others in the same situation getting the same thing is, oh, well, you must be a dualist. I said nothing about dualism. My position is so far from dualism. I am actually not an idealist, believe it or not. Right? I'm not a panpsychist. I'm not a dualist. I'm not a materialist. I'm not really any of the above there. But because I join in on some of the criticisms, right, of materialisms, you see that because of the assumptions. You get what I'm saying? So it's like, oh, well, you must be a dualist.
And I do the same thing when it comes to talking about theism. When a lot of people say that, oh, reality is the reality that we have, I would totally say, okay, well, wait a second. Is reality? We could all be a brain in a vat. Like, I mean, obviously, the paradigm that we're all kind of approaching the world with is that the world that we experience is real. Much in the same way, the paradigm that we have is our mind is the brain. And then, of course, there are certain people when they get so heavily rooted in it to totally take the opposite side and say, oh, well, you know what? It's healthy to have a little bit of skepticism, but there still are massive levels of burdens of proof that need to be met in order to even start to entertain a celestial teapot like what an idealist or something would propose, because there is a lot of evidence to show materialism. And even if it's not 100% correct, there is wanting evidence to support dualism or idealism or something else.
Yeah, but let me
very wanting evidence.
Yeah, let me interject.
Especially if you want to include like OBEs or NDEs, because those.
So let me do this, guys. I'm gonna I'm going to shut down this one and then start another one just so that the video can cycle, so I can send that to Bernardo. Okay. And then you can reconvene. I'll set that up for you guys. All right. But thank you all for listening, and thank you guys in the comments for doing that. Yeah. I'll set that up for you. So that you can respond, because I actually want to hear what you have to say also with that. So that'll be 2 minutes. But thank you so much for everything, guys.
All right.
I'll wrap that up.
You coming right back, AJ?
Yeah.
All right.